Greetings everyone. This is Arcane Paradox. Prepare yourselves for Goblin-Veela joint blood test on Harry age 9th revealed 61 stolen lordships and Dumbledore fled Britain. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The boy who smelled wrong. The Veela elder's name was Mireille Fontaine, and she had lived long enough to know that magic had a smell. Not literally, or not entirely literally. It was more that her kind perceived the world through a layer that humans didn't have access to, a shimmer of awareness that sat just beneath conscious thought and registered things the way a dog registers a thunderstorm 3 hours before the clouds arrive. Most humans smelled of their magic the way they smelled of their skin, naturally, without effort, the particular signature of a person's power woven into the air around them like something half-heard. A witch who worked with fire all her life smelled faintly of warm stone. A wizard who spent decades on healing magic carried something cool and green about him. It wasn't something you noticed unless you were Veela, and even then it was background noise, the olfactory wallpaper of the magical world. Mireille noticed the boy because he smelled like a locked room. She was sitting outside Madame Malkin's, waiting for her great-niece to finish trying on robes that the child absolutely did not need but had become inexplicably passionate about, when the boy walked past with his enormous cousin and a wail of a man she assumed was the father. He was small, too small, she thought, the particular smallness of a child who hadn't been fed quite enough for quite some time. His hair was a catastrophic mess and he wore clothes that could have fit 3 of him. He was looking at the ground with the practiced attention of someone who had learned that looking up attracted notice, and notice was dangerous. She would have let him pass. She had lived long enough to know that the wizarding world was full of quiet tragedies and that inserting herself into all of them would be both exhausting and unwelcome. She had learned to mind her business with the particular discipline of someone whose business had always been everyone else's. But then he walked past her and she smelled it. Wrong. That was the only word for it. Not dark magic, she knew dark magic, had smelled it on battlefields and in the aftermath of curses, and this wasn't that. This was something more structural. Like a building with the load-bearing walls quietly removed and replaced with something that looked almost identical but wouldn't hold when tested. Like a song with every third note shifted half a step down, subtly enough that you couldn't name the wrongness but felt it like a headache gathering behind your eyes. His magic smelled like a locked room because it was locked, not from the outside in the way underage magic was sealed, but from the inside, layered suppressions and redirections so carefully constructed that they had become part of the architecture of the child himself. Mireille had been sitting. She stood up. "Excuse me," she said, in English that carried 40 years of French vowels. "Boy." He stopped. He didn't look at her immediately, a child who had learned to assess threats before making eye contact. She noted that too, filed it away behind her teeth. When he did look up, she saw his eyes. Green. Brilliant, unusual green, with a scar bisecting his forehead like a crack in porcelain, and behind those eyes a watchfulness that had no business being there on a face that young. "Yes," he said. Politely. Carefully. "What is your name?" The fat man, the father, or what passed for one, turned around with the particular expression of someone who believed that all strangers were trying to sell him something. "Oi. Don't talk to my boy. Your boy." Mireille looked at the man for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to feel something he couldn't name and take a small step backward, and then she returned her attention to the child. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, still to the boy. "I simply wanted to say, you have very unusual magic." "It is a compliment," she added, because he had gone very still in the way children went still when they were deciding whether something was going to hurt them. He relaxed by approximately 3%. "Thank you," he said. "What is your name?" A pause. Brief, but there. "Harry," he said. "Harry what?" Another pause, longer. The fat man was starting to sputter. Harry glanced at him and then back at her, and something in his expression shifted, a decision being made behind those green eyes, quick and quiet. "Potter," he said. "Harry Potter." Mireille kept her face entirely still. Behind her, inside Madame Malkin's, her great-niece dropped something and began laughing with the shop girl. Mireille didn't look. She was doing a very careful set of calculations behind her pleasant expression, and the calculations were coming out in ways that made something cold settle in her chest. "It was very nice to meet you, Harry Potter," she said. "Enjoy your afternoon." He nodded once, grave and serious, and walked on with his cousin and his uncle. She watched them go. Then she turned and walked, quickly and without apparent urgency, to the white marble building at the end of the street. Gringotts on a Tuesday afternoon was busy in the way that banks were always busy, a particular orchestrated chaos of transactions and conversations and the distant sound of carts disappearing into the earth. Mireille walked past 3 queues and a minor argument about inheritance taxes without stopping, and she asked the first goblin teller whose eyes she caught, a young one, by goblin standards, though he still looked older than most buildings, to send a message to Director Ragnarok. Director Ragnarok does not take unsolicited. Tell him Mireille Fontaine of the Fontaine-Veela clan believes she has found a case of deep magical identity theft perpetrated on a child of significant lineage. She paused. Then tell him it's Harry Potter. He will know the name. The teller's expression didn't change. Goblins were excellent at that, but he moved immediately, which told her everything she needed to know about whether the goblins already had suspicions of their own. She waited for 11 minutes. Then a door opened that she hadn't noticed before, cut seamlessly into the marble, and a second goblin appeared and gestured for her to follow. Ragnarok's office was not what humans expected. Humans expected goblin spaces to be cramped and cluttered and obsessively gilded, because humans projected their own assumptions onto everything. The office was large, lit by steady magical light, and contained exactly 3 things that could be called decorative: a geological map of Britain's underground waterways, a small obsidian carving that she didn't look at too closely, and, on his desk, a stack of files thick enough to be architectural. The desk itself was built for someone taller than Ragnarok, because he had claimed it from the estate of a wizard who had defaulted on a debt, and he had kept it specifically because he liked the way it made wizards feel when they sat across from it and realized they were looking slightly down at him and then immediately regretted it. Ragnarok was old. Old for a goblin meant something different than old for a human. It meant his eyes had seen enough politics to have stopped being surprised by anything, and his patience had calcified into something that functioned like wisdom. He looked at Mireille when she entered with the particular expression of someone who has been turning a problem over for some time and is cautiously curious whether a visitor might be holding a piece of it. "Fontaine," he said. "Ragnarok." She sat without being invited. He didn't object. "I encountered Harry Potter in Diagon Alley 20 minutes ago." "Describe what you perceived." "Layered magical suppression. Not external, not a curse, not a hex. It's been integrated. Woven through his natural magical signature over time, which means it predates his conscious memory. His vault access has almost certainly been redirected. His name would show dormant lordship claims on any blood document, I imagine." She paused. "How many?" Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "We have never been able to run a full analysis on the child because we have never had legal grounds or physical access. He has never entered this bank. He's 9 years old and living with muggles. He presumably doesn't know he has grounds." "Precisely." Ragnarok turned a quill over in his fingers, a movement that she recognized as a thinking gesture rather than a fidgeting one. "The Fontaine clan has legal standing in British wizarding governance through the Treaty of 1762. "We do. A joint Goblin-Veela blood analysis cannot be disputed in any wizarding court in Europe. It is treaty law. The results are considered primary evidence." He set down the quill. "If a Veela elder formally requests such a test on a child of suspected stolen identity, Gringotts is legally required to conduct it." Mireille looked at him steadily. "Which is why you need me in the room. Which is why I am very glad you walked in that door." He stood, straightening his coat with the precise movements of someone who did not have time for disorder. "I would ask that you bring the boy in before his relatives take him back to wherever they're keeping him. Muggles in Diagon Alley are generally only here for one reason and they leave quickly." I'll need 10 minutes. I'll need 12 to prepare the ritual space. Take 11. Getting Harry Potter back to Gringotts took 8 minutes, not 11, because Mireille found him outside Ollivander's. The shop was closed for the afternoon, which the large cousin was loudly announcing was stupid, and she walked up to him with the particular energy of someone who had decided that the most efficient path was also the most direct one. "Harry," she said, "I work with the bank. I think there is a problem with your account that needs to be resolved immediately, and your presence is legally required." She said this perfectly calmly, projecting the specific frequency of authority that made humans assume they had already agreed to something. Then she turned to the uncle. "This will take approximately 40 minutes. There is an ice cream parlor 40 meters that direction." The uncle opened his mouth. She looked at him again with those 2 seconds of attention and he closed it. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he said, quietly, "I'll be all right, Uncle Vernon." Vernon Dursley accepted this the way large men often accepted things offered by smaller people, badly, but without any good argument against them. He pointed a fat finger at Harry in a way that was supposed to be threatening. 40 minutes, he said. "Or I'm leaving without you." 40 minutes, Mireille agreed pleasantly. She and Harry walked toward the bank. When they were far enough away, Harry said, without looking at her, "I don't have a bank account." "You do," she said. "Several." A pause. "I didn't know that." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. She glanced at him sideways. He wasn't frightened, she would have expected frightened, or at least anxious. He was thinking. Rapidly, carefully, the way children who had spent a great deal of time being overlooked learned to think when something finally paid them attention. "Are you Veela?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "What makes you ask?" "Your eyes," he said. "They're different." "Not bad different," he added, quickly, as though he'd learned to qualify observations that might accidentally sound like criticism. "Yes," she said. "I am. My teacher at school told us Veela aren't real." "Your teacher is wrong about many things, I imagine." Something flickered across his face, almost a smile, dawned before it fully formed. "Yeah," he said. "She is." They went up the stairs and through the doors and into the cool marble entrance of Gringotts, and Harry stopped walking for half a second when he crossed the threshold, because children with his kind of sensitivity always felt it, the shift in magical atmosphere, the way the bank's wards recognized and catalogued the magic of everyone who entered. He recovered immediately and kept walking, and Mireille noted that he'd felt it and noted his recovery with the same swift attention she'd been applying to everything about him since the moment he'd walked past her chair. The door in the marble wall opened again. This time, Mireille and Harry followed the goblin through together. The ritual space was not what Harry had expected, though she suspected he tried not to expect anything specific, since expectations were a luxury for children who had been given reliable information about their lives. It was a circular room 3 floors below the main bank, with walls of dark stone that held veins of something silver gold that pulsed very slowly, like a heartbeat at rest. The floor was inscribed with interlocking circles, old work, goblin runes overlapping with something older that Mireille recognized as pre-Roman magical notation. In the center was a raised dais with 2 chairs and, between them, a large flat stone that glowed faintly blue. 4 goblins stood at equidistant points around the room. Ragnarok stood at the far side, and he studied Harry the way he studied financial documents, with the particular focus of someone looking for the discrepancy he already suspected was there. "Harry Potter," Ragnarok said. "I am Director Ragnarok. This is a blood analysis ritual, jointly conducted under Goblin-Veela treaty law. It will not hurt you. It requires a single drop of blood on the analysis stone. The results will be comprehensive and legally binding. Do you consent?" Harry looked at the room, at the stone, at Ragnarok, and then at Mireille. She gave him nothing, she didn't want to influence him, wanted the decision to be genuinely his. Then he looked back at Ragnarok. "What will it tell you?" he asked. Ragnarok, who was not accustomed to being asked clarifying questions before consent, paused for a fraction of a second. Then he said, with what Mireille recognized as genuine respect, "It will tell us your full lineage, every magical inheritance you are entitled to, the status of every vault held in your name, and any magical alterations that have been made to your person, whether with or without your consent." "And if someone has done something to me without my consent," Harry said slowly, "this will show that?" "Yes." Harry thought about this for 3 more seconds. "All right," he said. "Yes. I consent." He walked to the dais without hesitation and sat in one of the chairs. He looked very small against the dark stone. He looked very steady. Mireille sat in the other chair. She pressed her palm to her side of the stone, activating the Veela portion of the ritual, feeling the old magic wake up under her hand like something remembering itself. Then a goblin came forward with a small silver implement that Harry looked at without flinching. He extended his hand. The pinprick was done. A drop of blood, perfect and dark red, fell to the center of the stone. For a moment nothing happened. Then the stone turned from blue to white, and the light intensified, and the ritual began to print. Paper was old-fashioned, goblins knew that. They also knew it was irrefutable in a way that magical projection wasn't. A physical document with an unbroken chain of magical authentication was worth considerably more in a courtroom than anything that could be argued to be illusion. So the analysis printed, because Gringotts had always printed, long curling sheets of parchment that spilled off the dais in both directions, inscribed in precise black script by magic rather than quill. The first page covered lineage. Harry watched it appear with the focused attention of a child being shown a map of somewhere he'd never been allowed to visit. Mireille read over his shoulder. Harry James Potter. Born July 31, 1980. Son of James Charles Potter and Lily Potter née Evans. Paternal grandfather, Charles Potter. Paternal great-grandfather, Henry Potter. Maternal line, Muggle-born, Evans family of Cokeworth, carrying dormant Fey bloodline, unseelie branch, Generation 7, non-dominant. She absorbed the Evans notation with interest and filed it away. The Fey bloodline was old and quiet, but it explained some of the unusual quality of his magic, not Veela, which she'd half wondered, but something adjacent, something that would have made him magically sensitive in ways that no one around him would have recognized or known what to do with. The second page covered inheritances. Mireille read the first 3 lines and felt something cold and careful settle over her expression. Harry read them too. His eyes moved steadily down the page. When he reached the end, when the paper reached the end, which took considerably longer than either of them anticipated, he said, very quietly, "That's a lot of names." "Yes," Ragnarok said. He had moved closer. His voice had taken on a quality she didn't often hear in him, a controlled stillness that she recognized as the goblin equivalent of fury. "It is." The inheritance section listed, in the precise bureaucratic language of magical law, 61 separate lordships. Some were small, minor family seats, ancient titles attached to plots of land smaller than the Hogwarts grounds. Some were not small at all. Some were ancient beyond reckoning, carrying seats on the Wisengamot and voting rights that would, by any reasonable legal reading, give one Harry James Potter, age 9, currently residing in a cupboard under the stairs in Surrey, which the blood document somehow knew and stated flatly, more political power in wizarding Britain than any individual had held in 4 centuries. Every single one of them showed the same status, claimed by proxy. Authorization signed, APWB Dumbledore. Vault access redirected. Lordship rights suspended pending majority, note, majority defined as never, see Addendum 7. Harry read Addendum 7. His eyes went through it twice. Then he looked up at Ragnarok. "He made it so I'd never inherit," Harry said. "Not a question. Just a statement, the way you might note that the weather had changed. He created a legal structure that would have maintained proxy control over your estates in perpetuity," Ragnarok said. "In the event of your death, which the documents anticipate with particular care, control would transfer to a secondary beneficiary selected by the proxy. He paused. The secondary beneficiary is also Albus Dumbledore. Silence in the round room. The four goblins at the walls had not moved, but there was a quality to their stillness now that hadn't been there before, something that Mireille, who had dealt with goblins for 60 years, recognized as institutional rage. Goblins didn't steal from their clients. That was the fundamental law, the bedrock principle of everything Gringotts represented. And someone had walked into their bank, signed documents in their halls, used their bureaucratic mechanisms as tools for the longest-running, most comprehensive magical theft in modern British history, and they hadn't known. They hadn't caught it, because the documents had been filed correctly, the authorizations had been signed by the appropriate guardian, and nothing had appeared wrong until a Veela elder had smelled a small boy in the street and walked into the bank with his name on her lips. "There's more," one of the analyzing goblins said, from his position at the wall. His voice was flat. Professional. Like a doctor delivering a diagnosis in a language you only half speak. "Tell me," Harry said. "Your mind," the goblin said, "carries two foreign magical constructs. The first is a compulsion ward, applied at age 15 months. It creates a strong emotional aversion to questioning your circumstances, your guardians, or your assigned role. It is designed to reinforce compliance and suppress independent ambition." A pause. "It has been significantly less effective than intended, due to your Fey bloodline, which we believe created a natural resistance. However, it has not been without effect." Harry was very still. Mireille watched his face. He wasn't falling apart, he was absorbing, processing, filing each piece away with a precision that was both impressive and quietly heartbreaking. "And the second," he said. "A monitoring construct," the goblin said. "It tracks your magical output, your emotional state, and your location. It reports to an external anchor, which based on the signature we can identify as a monitoring mirror held by," he glanced at Ragnarok. "Albus Dumbledore," Ragnarok finished. The paper continued printing. The vault section came next, and it was clinical in the way that financial documents always were, which somehow made it worse. The Potter family vaults, there were 11, the blood document informed them, not the single modest account Harry had presumably been told existed if he'd been told anything at all, had been systematically skimmed. Not emptied, because emptying them would have been noticeable. Skimmed. Small withdrawals, regular as a heartbeat, composing over 9 years a figure that Mireille looked at and then looked at again. "That's in galleons?" Harry asked, looking at the same figure. "Yes," Ragnarok said. Harry did the mental conversion. She could tell from the small movement of his lips that he was doing arithmetic. His expression didn't change significantly when he arrived at the answer, but something behind his eyes shifted, the look of someone recalibrating the scale of a map they'd been walking without. The third foreign construct noted on the document was the scar. Not the curse, the goblins acknowledged the killing curse residue with a brief notation, identified it, categorized it, but something inside the scar that was distinct from the curse mark. A fragment. A piece of something that had no business being in a living person, attached like a parasite to the deepest level of his magical core, feeding on it so slowly that it had never triggered any alarm because it had never taken enough at once to register. Mireille looked at that section of the document for a long time. Then she looked at Harry. He had gone to the window of knowledge that opened this piece and looked through it and apparently decided, with the pragmatism of someone who has been processing impossible information for the last 20 minutes, to simply absorb it as data and move on. "Can it be removed?" he asked. "Yes," Ragnarok said. "It would be the work of 2 days and would require a goblin curse-breaking team of 6. The procedure is unpleasant but not dangerous to the host, provided the host has sufficient magical strength." He looked at Harry with the first expression she'd seen on his face that wasn't careful neutrality. "You have exceptional magical strength, Mr. Potter. Exceptional in a manner that is itself significant. Because of the Lordships?" Harry asked. "No. The Lordships would grant you institutional power, legal authority, financial resources. The magic is yours." Ragnock moved to the analysis stone and pointed at a section of the document that had printed while they were reading the others, a short section, dense with notation, at the top of which was a header that read, Core Classification. The Goblin Magical Index measures magical core potential on a scale of 1 to 100, with 100 being the documented theoretical maximum. Most witches and wizards fall between 30 and 60. Recorded historical maximums in living memory have reached into the 80s. Harry looked at the number on the document. So did Mireille. She had been prepared, after everything she'd smelled in the street, for something significant. She had not been prepared for that. 94. Harry said. A provisional assessment, Ragnock said. Because your core has been partially suppressed since age 15 months, the true number may be higher. We cannot say how much higher until the compulsion ward and monitoring construct are removed. But even the provisional assessment is, he paused, and chose his next word with the deliberateness of someone picking a weapon. Unprecedented. The printing had slowed. The last sheet of parchment curled off the dais and settled on the floor in the silence of the round room, and they all stood there with 61 stolen lordships and 9 years of theft and a compulsion ward and a monitoring construct and a parasitic fragment and a 94 on a scale where 100 was the ceiling, all of it spread across parchment on the floor around a small boy with messy hair and clothes that didn't fit him. Harry looked at all of it for a moment. Then he looked at Ragnock. What do we do first? He said. Ragnock looked back at him, and something in the old goblin's expression settled into a new shape, something that Mireille recognized, because she'd seen it in the faces of generals when they found an unexpected ally on a field where they'd thought they were outnumbered. First, Ragnock said, we remove the monitoring construct. Immediately, before we take any other action. If Dumbledore's mirror alerts him that you are in this bank undergoing analysis, he'll know we know, Harry finished. Yes. How do you remove it without him noticing the removal? Ragnock almost smiled. Not quite, goblins almost never quite smiled, but close. We do not remove it. We redirect it. We feed it a false signal, your location and magical output as it appeared 30 minutes ago, when you were in Diagon Alley. He will believe you are still shopping. Harry thought about this. And when I leave? When I actually move? We will have contingencies in place, Ragnock said. This is not a situation that can be resolved in 40 minutes. There are, he gestured at the floor. At all of it. There are considerable next steps. My uncle, Harry said. He'll leave without me. If necessary, a Gringotts representative will have a conversation with him, Ragnock said, with the particular confidence of an institution that had been having conversations with humans since before the Norman conquest and had not yet lost a single one. Harry nodded. Just once. Then, and the compulsion ward? The thing on my mind. That we will also remove, but not today. The monitoring redirect must be established first. The ward removal is a more significant procedure and will require your sustained presence over several hours. We suggest, Ragnock glanced at Mireille. She gave him the small nod that meant yes, our resources are available. We suggest it be done within the week, at a location that the monitoring construct believes is somewhere else. You can manage that? We can manage considerably more than that, Mr. Potter. Ragnock turned to one of the wall goblins. Fetch Cursebreaker Sharpstone. Tell him I need the monitoring redirect in. He glanced back at Harry. 20 minutes. Please, Harry said. The goblin moved. Mireille watched Harry watching the room, the way his eyes moved, cataloging exits and allies and information with the same quick precision she'd been watching all afternoon. He caught her looking and didn't look away, which most adults didn't manage around her. You knew something was wrong, he said. Before. In the street. I smelled it, she said. He absorbed this without finding it strange. You came to the bank right away. Yes. Why? And there it was, not suspicion, but genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand her motivation, was assessing whether he could trust it. Because you are 9 years old, she said simply, and someone has been stealing from you since before you could walk. That is not a complicated reason. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then something in his face changed, not dramatically, not a collapse or a release of feeling, just a small, careful softening, the way ice shifts in the first real day of spring, not melting, just acknowledging that the temperature has changed. "Thank you," he said. And meant it differently than he'd meant it in the street, when it was polite and careful and automatic. This was something else, something real, from somewhere below the performance of fine that he'd been running since at least 15 months old. Mireille inclined her head. "This is only the beginning, you understand." "I know," he said. He looked at the parchment on the floor again, at his inheritance, his stolen rights, the map of everything that had been taken from him before he was old enough to understand what taking meant. He looked at it the way you look at a battlefield before you walk into it, measuring, noting the terrain, identifying the high ground. 61, he said, almost to himself. Yes. That's a lot of names. It is, she agreed. Some of them are on the Wiesengemot. He nodded slowly. So when we file, it's not just about the vaults. It's about the votes. She looked at him. He was 9. He had been in this bank for 32 minutes. He had just learned that the entirety of his known existence had been engineered by a man he'd probably only heard of in passing, and the first strategic implication he'd identified was the political one. Yes, she said. It is very much about the votes. Ragnarok had returned to his desk. He was already writing, the scratch of his quill rapid and purposeful. The 4 goblins at the walls were in motion now, coordinating with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had been managing crises since Roman occupation, and the Cursebreaker was coming, and in the parchment on the floor was the beginning of something that was going to move very fast and reach very far. Harry James Potter, age 9, underfed, wearing clothes that could have fit someone twice his size, sat on the dais of a Gringotts ritual room and watched Director Ragnarok draft the first legal document of what was going to be the most consequential series of filings in the history of British wizarding law. Mr. Potter, Ragnarok said, without looking up from his writing. Yes. When the Cursebreaker has finished the redirect, and while we await the ward removal procedure, I would like to spend the remainder of the afternoon walking you through what has been taken, how it was taken, and who signed every document authorizing the taking. He did look up then, and his dark eyes were steady and absolutely certain. Knowledge is the first inheritance. The vaults and the lordships come after. Harry held his gaze. All right, he said. Let's start. Outside, Vernon Dursley ate ice cream for 40 minutes and then waited another 20 and then went home to Privet Drive without him, which he would later tell Petunia had been a great relief. He would regret this, eventually. But not yet. In the round room below Gringotts, a Cursebreaker arrived, and the monitoring construct was redirected, and a 9-year-old boy with a provisional magic rating of 94 and 61 stolen lordships and a compulsion ward on his mind sat across a desk from the director of Gringotts and began, for the first time in his life, to learn who he actually was. The stone pulsed silver gold around them, slow as a heartbeat, steady as the decision being made in that room, a decision that would, before the week was out, send owls to families across Britain who had believed their ancient seats were simply dormant, that the old names had simply faded, that nothing had been taken from them because nothing had been there to take. They were wrong. And in approximately 72 hours, they were all going to find out exactly how wrong. Mireille Fontaine sat in the corner of the room and watched Harry Potter discover the shape of his own stolen life, and she thought, whoever built this cage had better have built somewhere safe to run to. She was fairly certain they hadn't. Chapter 2, What the Ledgers Say 3 days was not a long time to restructure your understanding of your entire life. Harry had managed it in 2. He was sitting in a chair in a private office on the second sublevel of Gringotts, not the ritual room, which had been cleaned and sealed after the redirect was established, but a working office, wood-paneled and lit by 4 steady lamps, with a desk large enough to lay out documents without them overlapping. There were a great many documents. They covered the desk and 2 auxiliary tables that had been conjured on the second day, and they were organized by category in a system that Harry had devised himself after spending approximately 4 hours watching Ragnar's assistants arrange them by date and finding the chronological approach infuriating. "Date tells me when," he'd said, "on the evening of the first day. I need to know who. And then how much." Ragnar had looked at the arrangement his staff had spent 2 hours constructing. Then he'd said, "Reorganize by signatory," and walked away, and his staff had reorganized without a word of complaint because when the director agreed with a 9-year-old's filing logic, you reorganized. The Dursleys had been handled. Ragnar had, as promised, sent a representative, not a goblin, interestingly, but a wizard from Gringotts' legal division named Forthright who wore a very expensive suit and had the kind of face that said I will be completely reasonable and you will find this somehow more terrifying than aggression. Forthright had arrived at Privet Drive on the evening of the first day and explained to Vernon Dursley that his ward was in protective legal custody of Gringotts Bank pending a significant inheritance matter, that this was fully within the bank's legal rights under both magical and muggle law, and that the Department of Family Services would be notified of Mr. Dursley's decision to return home without his charge if Mr. Dursley found any of this objectionable. Vernon Dursley had not found any of it objectionable. He had, in fact, found it something of a relief, which Forthright had reported back with the professional neutrality of someone who found humans endlessly predictable and had stopped being surprised by them decades ago. Harry had received this information, thanked Forthright, and returned to his documents. The compulsion ward removal had happened on the second morning. It had taken 4 hours and been deeply unpleasant in the way that Ragnar had promised, not painful, exactly, but like having something taken out of your thinking that you hadn't known was in there, which left strange gaps in its wake, absences where certainty used to be. He'd spent the afternoon after it in something of a fog, and Mire, who had remained, partly out of what Harry suspected was genuine concern and partly because her Veela senses were useful diagnostically, had made him eat something and sleep before he was allowed to look at any more documents. He'd slept for 11 hours. He'd woken up and felt, for the first time he could consciously remember, like his own thoughts were entirely his own. It was a strange feeling. It was also, quietly, one of the best feelings he'd ever had. Now it was the morning of the third day, and Ragnar arrived at 8 o'clock precisely, as he had on the previous 2 mornings, carrying 2 cups of something hot, tea for Harry, something darker and more complex smelling for himself, and settled into the chair across the main desk. "Shall we continue with the Black Lordship documents?" Ragnar said, "or would you prefer to start with the summary financial assessment?" Sharpstone finished the vault reconciliation at midnight. "Financial summary first," Harry said. "Then Black. I want to understand the full scope before I go deeper on individual cases." Ragnar produced a single sheet from his coat, a document so dense with numbers that it should have been overwhelming, and which Harry had learned, over 3 days, to read the way you read a weather map, not every figure individually but the pattern they composed together. He read it in silence for 90 seconds. "Walk me through the column on the right," he said. "Current total value of all assets held under your name, including the 61 lordship estates, the 11 Potter vaults, and the subsidiary holdings in France, Germany, and," Ragnar paused, briefly. "Egypt." "Egypt," Harry repeated. "The Potter line has an old relationship with certain magical sites in the Valley of the Kings. It is not relevant to the immediate matter but I mention it because the Egyptian holdings have been untouched. Dumbledore was apparently unaware of them. Or couldn't access them," Harry said. Ragnar's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters, which meant he was impressed. "Also possible. The Egyptian wards predate modern magical governance by several thousand years and operate on different principles. They would have recognized an unauthorized accessor. So he took what he could reach and left what he couldn't." Harry looked at the figure again. "What's the current total after the skimming?" Ragnar told him. Harry set the document down on the desk and looked at the middle distance for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked back at Ragnar. "And before the skimming, the total that should be there?" Ragnar told him that figure too. Harry absorbed the difference between the 2 numbers with the same deliberate calm he'd been applying to everything, which Mire, sitting in her customary corner chair with a book she wasn't really reading, recognized as the particular composure of someone who has learned that feeling things too loudly in front of other people is dangerous, and who therefore saved all of it for somewhere private and showed the world only the working. Right, Harry said. The reclamation filing, when we file that, will Gringotts pursue the skimmed amount as well? Gringotts will pursue it with considerable enthusiasm, Ragnarok said, with a flatness that was the goblin version of intensity. Unauthorized withdrawal from client vaults is a violation of banking law that we take, he paused. Personally. Because it makes the bank look like it didn't notice. Because it is a theft committed through us, Ragnarok said, and that came out with an edge, quiet but real. Our processes, our paperwork, our authorization systems. Used as instruments. Yes. We take that personally. Harry nodded. He filed this away in the drawer marked useful motivations, not because he didn't believe Ragnarok's anger was genuine, but because understanding what drove the people you were working with was the same as understanding the tools you were working with, and you didn't pick up a tool without knowing how it was weighted. He pulled the black file toward him. It was thick, thicker than most of the others, because the black situation was not simply a matter of a stolen lordship. It was a stolen lordship compounded by a wrongful imprisonment compounded by an unauthorized will substitution compounded by 3 separate fraudulent legal filings, all of which had been executed with surgical precision between November 1981 and March 1982, a 4-month window during which magical Britain had been in enough chaos that nobody had looked too hard at the paperwork coming out of the ministry's estate division. Sirius Black, Harry said. Not a question. He was reading. Lord Sirius Orain Black, Ragnarok confirmed. Rightful heir to the ancient and most noble house of Black, currently, and I use the word currently with full awareness of its implications, imprisoned in Azkaban. Without a trial, Harry said. Without a trial, Ragnarok agreed. Arrested on 1 November 1981, transported to Azkaban on 2 November. No formal charges were filed in the Wizengamot. No trial was scheduled. The paperwork authorizing his detention was signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr., Harry said, reading it from the document. And countersigned by, he stopped. He read the countersignature twice. Dumbledore again, he said. As chief warlock of the Wizengamot at the time, his countersignature on emergency detention orders was legally required, Ragnarok said. It is not, on its face, unusual. What is unusual is the specific wording of the emergency classification, which, he leaned forward and pointed to a section of text halfway down the page. Defines Black as an imminent ongoing threat requiring indefinite detention without review, which is a legal category that has not been applied to any other prisoner in the last 2 centuries and which was, as far as our researchers can determine, created specifically for this case. The legislation enabling it was passed through a closed Wizengamot session 3 days after the arrest, using emergency protocols that prevented public record. Harry looked at the date on the legislation. Then at the date Sirius had been taken to Azkaban. He was already in Azkaban when they passed the law making it legal to keep him there. Yes. They arrested him first and wrote the law second. Yes. Harry set the document down. He stood up. He'd learned over 3 days that he thought better when he was moving, and the office was just large enough to walk 3 paces each way, which wasn't ideal but was sufficient. He paced, slowly, looking at the floor. The Black Lordship, he said. It was declared dormant, Ragnarok said. On the grounds that the heir was imprisoned in the secondary heir, he produced another document. Regulus Arcturus Black, deceased November 1979, was dead. The estate was held in abeyance, managed by a ministry-appointed trustee. Who is the trustee? Ragnarok's silence lasted just long enough to make the answer obvious before he gave it. Albus Dumbledore, Harry said. Who donated the trusteeship fee to a children's hospital, publicly, every year, Ragnarok said, which made reviewing the arrangement politically difficult. Harry stopped pacing. He turned and looked at the wall of documents, all of it, the 61 files, the financial summaries, the unauthorized legislation, the fraudulent filings, and felt something click into place. Not anger. Something colder and more useful than anger. The particular feeling of seeing the whole shape of something that had been presented to you as a series of unconnected events. It's one system, he said. Ragnarok waited. Not a series of individual thefts. Not opportunism. It's designed. He turned to face Ragnarok. He didn't steal my lordships and then separately arrange to have Sirius imprisoned and then separately drain the vaults. It's connected. Each piece makes the other pieces harder to see. He moved back to the desk, pulling documents. If Sirius is in Azkaban, there's no adult black ally who might investigate the estate irregularities. If the vaults are being quietly skimmed, nobody's looking at the vault records because nothing dramatic is happening. If the compulsion ward is on my mind, I'm not asking questions. If the monitoring construct tracks me, he knows immediately if anyone tries to talk to me about my inheritance. He laid the documents out in the order that showed the connections. He built a system. Every part of it maintains every other part. The room was quiet. Mireille had put down her book at some point in the last few minutes and was watching him with the focused attention of someone watching a complicated machine assemble itself. Yes, Ragnarok said. That is our assessment as well. It took our analysis team 2 days to reach the same conclusion. A pause, brief and deliberate. You have been here for 3 days. Harry looked at him. I had more motivation to see it quickly. Ragnarok almost smiled again. Indeed. He pulled the largest document from his coat, not a sheet but a bound volume, thin but formal, its cover bearing the Gringotts seal in deep red wax. This is the preliminary legal filing. It covers the vault reclamation, the lordship restoration, the removal of unauthorized magical constructs, which we have already begun, internally, and the petition for review of the black imprisonment. It requires your signature in 3 places and Madame Fontaine's counter-signature as the presiding Veela witness. Where does it go when we file it? Simultaneously to 6 locations, Ragnarok said. The British Ministry of Magic, specifically the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The International Confederation of Wizards. The European Magical Governance Council. The Wiesengemot Clerk's Office. The Department for the Regulation of Magical Inheritances. And, he set the volume on the desk. The British Magical Press, via sealed document with a 24-hour release delay, which gives the ministry time to respond before the public finds out and removes any possibility of them quietly making this go away. Harry looked at the document. 24 hours, he said. That's how long Dumbledore will have to react before this is public. Yes. He'll know the moment it's filed. The ministry will tell him. Almost certainly. Harry looked at the filing for another moment. Then he opened it, found the first signature line, and held out his hand for a quill. One of Ragnarok's assistants produced one immediately. Harry signed his name, Harry J. Potter, in handwriting that was careful and clear and nothing like the signature of a 9-year-old who didn't know what he was doing. He moved to the second signature line. Signed again. He found the third. Signed. He closed the document and slid it across the desk to Mireille, who had risen from her chair and crossed the room without being asked. She read the counter-signature section, produced her own quill from somewhere in her robes. Veela Elder, Harry had noted, always had their own quill, it was a dignity thing, and signed with the particular flourish of someone who knew that her signature on this document was going to be cited in legal proceedings for the next 50 years. Ragnarok took the document back. He looked at it for a moment with an expression Harry had not seen on his face before, something that might have been, on a different kind of face, satisfaction. Then he handed it to his assistant, said something brief in gobbledygook, and the assistant left immediately. It will be filed within the hour, Ragnarok said. The ministry will have it on record by noon. The 24-hour clock begins then. Harry nodded. He was already thinking ahead. The families, he said. The ones whose lordships are listed. When they receive notice that their seats have been restored, some of them are going to have a very significant reaction. They will receive formal notification from Gringotts within 2 hours of the filing, Ragnarok said. The notification will include a full accounting of how their lordship was transferred, by whom, and when. It will also include documentation of any financial irregularities affecting their estates during the period of proxy control. So some of them are going to be angry at Dumbledore, Harry said. And some of them are going to be angry at me, because they won't understand what happened and they'll look for a simpler target. Possibly, Ragnarok said. Does that concern you? Harry thought about it honestly. No, he said. Because the documentation is airtight. If someone wants to challenge the filing, they have to explain why their lordship shows Dumbledore's signature on the transfer authorization. There's no version of that conversation that ends well for him. You could have been a banker, Ragnarok said. I'm 9, Harry said. I know. That's why it's a compliment. The first response from the ministry came at 2:17 in the afternoon, in the form of a fire call to the Gringotts communication room that Harry was not, technically, supposed to be present for, except that Ragnarok had told his assistant to let him know when the call came and the assistant had interpreted let him know as show him to the communication room immediately, which Harry suspected was not an accident. The witch on the other end of the fire was not someone Harry recognized, a ministry official, mid-level by her robes, with the particular expression of someone who had been handed a problem by someone above her and instructed to resolve it without leaving fingerprints. She was approximately 40, with careful hair and eyes that moved quickly. Director Ragnarok, she said, keeping her voice professional and level. We've received a rather significant filing from your institution this morning. You have, Ragnarok agreed. The ministry would like to request a delay in the simultaneous notifications to the Wisingamot clerks and the, no, Ragnarok said. A pause. Director, there are procedures for managing, the filing is legally compliant, conducted under joint Goblin-Veela treaty law, and every notification has been dispatched per the requirements of the 1762 Treaty of Magical Governance. Ragnarok's voice was perfectly pleasant. The ministry's request for delay has no legal basis and is noted as received. Is there anything else? The chief warlock has no jurisdiction over Gringotts' internal legal filings, Ragnarok said. He is, additionally, a named party in the filing, which creates a conflict of interest that would prevent his review under any reasonable legal standard. He paused. Please communicate this to his office. Another pause. Longer. Harry watched the witch's face, watched the moment she recognized that this particular conversation had no exits. I see, she said. Thank you, Director. The fire went green and died. Ragnarok turned to look at Harry. That was the first call, he said. There will be more. How many? Before sunset? Probably 7. They will escalate in seniority. He settled back in his chair. The 4th or 5th will likely be the minister himself. And Dumbledore? Harry asked. Will he call? Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. No, he said. If he is as intelligent as his history suggests, he will not call. He will move. He moved at 4:30. Not to Gringotts, that would have been legally catastrophic and he knew it. He moved to the one place he had standing and authority, Hogwarts, and through Hogwarts to the Wisingamot, via an emergency session request filed through his office as Chief Warlock, citing matters of significant public governance requiring urgent deliberation. Harry found out about this when Mireille returned from a brief walk to the Leaky Cauldron. She'd wanted news, and the Leaky Cauldron's barman had an ear for ministry movement that most newspapers envied, and came back into the Gringotts office with a look that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to it. He's called an emergency Wisingamot session, she said. For tomorrow morning. Ostensibly to review the filing. That's fast, Harry said. He's trying to contain it before the press release hits, she said. If he can get the Wisingamot to vote to suspend the filing, classify it under national security provisions, seal it, something, he can buy time. Can they do that? Harry looked at Ragnarok. No, Ragnarok said. The filing is under international treaty law. The British Wisengamot cannot suspend it without triggering a review by the International Confederation, which would create approximately 10 times the visibility Dumbledore is trying to avoid. He paused. However, the session creates a stage. And Dumbledore is very good at stages. Harry looked at the desk, at the documents, at the organized chaos of the case they'd spent 3 days building. He thought about stages. He thought about 61 families receiving owls tomorrow morning. He thought about a man who had built a system so careful and so comprehensive that it had run for 9 years without anyone looking at it too hard. He wants the session to be about the filing, Harry said. As if it's an administrative irregularity. Something to be managed. Yes. Then the session needs to be about something he can't manage from a podium. He looked at Ragnarok. Can I attend? Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. You have 61 Wisengamot seats, he said. The restoration of those seats is part of the filed documentation. The question of whether those seats are already legally active before a formal Wisengamot vote on your majority status is, he paused. Contested. But not clearly resolved against me. Not clearly resolved at all. Which means the question would need to be raised, deliberated, and voted on before the session could exclude you. Harry looked at him. So if I arrive before the session opens, if you arrive with legal representation and a valid claim to standing, they'd have to deliberate on the standing question before they could do anything else. Yes. And the deliberation would itself be a matter of public record. Harry thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. I'll need a solicitor. Gringotts has several on retainer, Ragnarok said. I would suggest Madame Norsharp. She is the most aggressive of them and she has been waiting since she joined our firm 8 years ago for a case that is genuinely significant. He paused. She is also, I should mention, one of the most thorough people I have ever met. She arrived at 8 this morning having already read the preliminary filing twice. You already called her, Harry said. I informed her that a potentially significant case had been filed, Ragnarok said, and that a client might require representation at a Wisengamot session tomorrow. She said, and I quote, I'll be there at 7. Harry nodded. Then we have tonight to prepare. Norsharp arrived at 6, not 7, because she had apparently reconsidered the timeline sometime around 5 and decided that an extra hour was not a luxury she was willing to forego. She was British-Egyptian, 41, with ink on her right hand that she hadn't noticed and sharp brown eyes that noticed everything else. She shook Harry's hand, sat down at the document-covered desk, and spent the next 4 minutes reading in silence. Right, she said. I have questions. Ask, Harry said. The Black Petition, is there physical evidence of Pettigrew's survival? Harry looked at Ragnarok. This was a piece they discussed but not fully resolved. The blood test shows the monitoring construct on me was anchored through a secondary magical signature, Harry said. The signature matches the Black Family Magical Index, which we believe was the connection Dumbledore exploited to. That's not what I asked, Nor said. She wasn't impatient, just precise. I asked about Pettigrew. Pettigrew was never confirmed dead, Ragnarok said. The scene in Muggle London was reviewed by Ministry Aurors who found a finger and a great deal of blood. No body. The classification as deceased was made on the basis of the finger and Black's testimony at the scene, testimony that was not taken under Veritaserum or any formal evidentiary standard because there was no formal proceeding. So the foundation of Black's imprisonment, Nor said, is a single finger. And Dumbledore's countersignature on the detention order. Nor was quiet for a moment. The Wisengamot session tomorrow, she said. Dumbledore will try to reframe this as a procedural challenge. He'll say the treaty filing was conducted improperly, that Harry's age makes him legally incapable of consenting to. The Goblin-Veela treaty specifically includes a provision for the testing of minors in cases of suspected magical identity fraud, Ragnarok said. Article 9, Paragraph 4. The minor's consent is sufficient. No guardian signature is required when the guardian is a suspected party to the fraud. Nor looked at him. Article 9, Paragraph 4. Yes. She wrote this down. Good. What else? They worked until midnight. Harry asked questions when he had them, listened when he didn't, and ate the meal that appeared at 9 o'clock without noticing much about what it was. Mireille sat with them for part of it and excused herself at 10, citing an early communication she needed to make to the Fontaine Clan Council, because the clan needed to be briefed before tomorrow and she wanted to ensure that the Elder Council's formal support was on record before the session opened. At midnight, Nor rolled up her notes, capped her ink, and looked at Harry across the document-covered desk. "You're 9, she said. Not unkindly. Just noting it." "Yes," Harry said. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to walk into the most politically significant Wizengamot session in 30 years with you as my client." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you know what you want the outcome to look like?" "Not legally, I understand the legal objectives. I mean, what do you want, at the end of this?" Harry thought about it. He thought about the compulsion ward and the years of careful smallness, of looking at the ground, of learning that existence itself was something that needed to be kept quiet. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban for 9 years without a trial, and he thought about 61 families who were going to wake up tomorrow and discover that their ancient seats had been sitting in someone else's coat pocket. He thought about a very old man who had built a cage and called it protection and kept a small boy in it and apparently believed, with complete sincerity, that this was love. "I want the truth to be on record," he said. "All of it. Publicly, legally, permanently. I want it to be impossible for anyone to make this go away or soften it into something more comfortable." He paused. "And I want Sirius Black to have a trial." Nor studied him for a moment longer. "Those are achievable objectives," she said. "I know," Harry said. She picked up her things and left. Harry stayed at the desk for another hour, reading, until Ragnar's assistant appeared at the door and said, with the particular expression of someone carrying a polite instruction from a goblin director, that Mr. Potter was required to sleep before tomorrow, and that a room had been prepared on the first sublevel, and that the documents would still be there in the morning. Harry looked at the documents. He looked at the room. He thought about the monitoring construct, gone now, redirected and then fully removed on the second day, and the compulsion ward, gone too, and what it felt like to have the inside of his own head finally be entirely his. He thought about how small the cupboard at Privet Drive was and how large this room felt by comparison, and how strange it was that Gringotts Bank was the first place that had ever felt like somewhere he was meant to be. He put down the document he was holding. He went to the room they'd prepared. He slept well, which surprised him. He'd half expected the weight of everything to keep him up, 61 names, 9 years of engineered smallness, a man who treated his entire life as a variable in someone else's equation. But none of it kept him up. He had the particular ability, rare in children and rarer in adults, to put things down for a few hours because he understood instinctively that exhaustion was a liability and rest was strategy. He woke at 6. Got up. Ate the breakfast that appeared. Someone had clearly briefed the kitchen on the preferences of 9-year-olds, because there was toast and eggs and tea with too much milk in it, which was exactly right. He read for an hour. He was ready by 7:15 when Nurse Sharp arrived in a formal robe that was the color of deep water, carrying her notes, with the ink washed off her hand but back on it in a different spot already. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," Harry said. "Did anything come in overnight?" 14 owls, she said. 3 from Wizengamot members seeking clarification on the filing, 2 from journalists, 1 from the minister's personal office, and 9 from families named in the Lordship Restoration. How many of the family letters were angry? She thought about it. 2. The other 7 were, she paused. Curious. Guarded. One of them was from Narcissa Malfoy, which I found interesting. Harry looked at her. What did she say? Nor produced the letter and handed it across. Harry read it. It was brief, 2 paragraphs, formal in the way of someone who had been trained since birth to use formality as a tool rather than a convention, and its essential content was, I am aware of the filing. I am aware that the Malfoy family's interests are partially implicated. I would find it useful to speak with the relevant parties before the Wisengamot session. I do not write this as a threat. I write this as someone who has learned, recently, that the information she has been operating on is insufficient. Harry folded the letter. He put it in his pocket. We'll see, he said. Ragnarok appeared at 7:30, already moving with the purposeful energy of someone who had been working since 5. The Wisengamot session is set for 9 o'clock, he said. The chamber has received notification that Lord Potter's legal representative will be seeking standing for her client at the opening of proceedings. He looked at Harry. Are you ready? Harry picked up his document case. Ragnarok had had one made for him on the second day, dark leather, with his name pressed into it in gold letters, because Ragnarok understood that presentation was part of the argument. He looked at Nor. He looked at Ragnarok. Dumbledore's going to be in that room, Harry said. Almost certainly, Ragnarok said. He will be there in his capacity as Chief Warlock, presiding over a session he himself called. He's presiding over his own case, Harry said. Which is a conflict of interest we will raise immediately, Nor said. And while the chamber debates the conflict of interest, the owls are going out, Nor said. The 61 families. They'll receive their notifications while the session is in progress. Some of them have seats in the chamber. Harry absorbed this. Thought about it. Saw the shape of it. So he'll call the session to contain the situation, he said, and the situation will walk through the door in the first 30 seconds. That, Nor said, straightening her robe, is the idea. Outside, London was waking up. The magical world was waking up. Somewhere in it, a great many owls were preparing to fly, carrying sealed documents with Gringotts authentication seals and the names of 61 families on the envelopes. Somewhere in it, Albus Dumbledore was in a chamber he'd presided over for decades, arranging his argument, believing, because he always believed, that he was still the most informed person in the room. Harry picked up his document case. He walked to the door. He was 9 years old and he was going to the Wisengamot, and he was not afraid. Chapter 3, The Wisengamot Cracks. The British Wisengamot Chamber was built to impress. That was its primary architectural function, more than acoustics or sight lines or the practical business of fitting 200 people into a circular room. It was built with high ceilings that made voices carry upward and dissipate, with tiered seating that looked down at the central floor from 3 sides, with dark wood paneling so old it had absorbed decades of magic and now faintly hummed with it. The chairs were carved and high-backed and deeply uncomfortable, which was intentional. The people who designed the chamber had believed that physical discomfort sharpened attention and that comfort was a luxury that led to complacency and that neither quality was useful in a legislative body. Harry walked in and looked at it the way he looked at everything, quickly, completely, cataloging what was useful. The central floor was where witnesses and petitioners stood. He noted the acoustics. The floor was the loudest point in the room, voices thrown back from the curved ceiling in a way that made whatever was said there carry to every corner. He noted the 2 doors, one behind the central floor and one behind the Chief Warlock's elevated seat at the chamber's head. He noted that approximately 60 of the tiered seats were already occupied, which was significant because the session was technically 40 minutes from opening. People had come early. Word had traveled fast. Nor walked beside him with the contained energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of morning. Mireille was 3 steps behind, in formal Veela elder's robes, deep cream-edged in silver, that Harry had not seen before and which communicated, to anyone in the chamber who knew what they were looking at, that the Fontaine clan was here in an official capacity. Ragnarok had not come. Goblins did not attend Wisengamot sessions. He had made this very clear and then made it equally clear that he would have a full transcript on his desk within 20 minutes of anything being said. They took a position near the central floor. Not on it, not yet. Nor had been precise about this. We wait until the session is called to order. Then we move. The standing petition goes in before the first item on the agenda. If we move too early, we look impatient. If we move exactly on the gavel, we look inevitable. Harry looked at the occupied seats while they waited. He recognized no one by face. He had no basis for recognition, having spent his entire life in a Muggle suburb, but the family sigils on the seat backs gave him information. He'd spent part of the previous evening studying the Wizengamot seating chart that Ragnarok's office had provided, learning the names and the house affiliations and the voting histories that were a matter of public record. He'd absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, not trying to memorize, just letting it settle, trusting that it would be there when he needed it. The chamber filled steadily. He felt the moment he was recognized, a ripple of attention from the tiered seats, heads turning, conversations pausing. A 9-year-old with a document case and a Scar and Veela elder backing was not what most of them had expected when they'd arrived at 8:20 in the morning for an emergency governance session. He didn't look back. He was watching the door behind the Chief Warlock's seat. It opened at 8:51. Albus Dumbledore walked through it, and Harry saw him for the first time. He had heard the name, obviously. Everyone in the magical world had heard the name. Mireille had described him. Ragnarok had described him. The documents had described him in the driest possible language, which was somehow the most damning. None of it had quite prepared Harry for the physical fact of him, the great height, the silver beard, the deep purple robes, the half-moon glasses catching the chamber light. He was old in the way that certain buildings were old, not crumbling but established, his age an argument for his permanence rather than his fragility. He moved to the Chief Warlock's seat with the unhurried confidence of a man who had sat in it so many times that the wood had probably shaped itself to him. He settled. He arranged his robes. He looked out over the filling chamber with those famously warm blue eyes, and then, with the particular calculation of a very intelligent man who has just encountered something unexpected, those eyes found Harry. They looked at each other across the chamber. Harry didn't look away. He stood on the central floor's edge and met Dumbledore's gaze with the steady attention of someone who had spent 3 days reading every document that described what this man had done, and who had come here not to be angry about it but to do something about it, which was a different thing entirely. Something moved in Dumbledore's expression. It was fast, a professional's control snapping back over it quickly, but Harry had been watching for it and he caught it. Not guilt. Not alarm. Something more complex, the particular look of someone who has spent a long time being the most informed person in any given room suddenly encountering the possibility that this is no longer true. Then Dumbledore turned away and spoke to his clerk, and the moment was done. The gavel came down at 9 o'clock exactly. The emergency session of the Wizengamot is called to order, the clerk announced. Presiding, Chief Warlock Albus Dumbledore. The stated purpose of this session is review of a joint Goblin-Veela treaty filing received by the Ministry of Magic on, Madam Clerk. Nor was on her feet and moving to the central floor before the clerk had finished her sentence. Her voice carried effortlessly, she'd clearly calculated the acoustics herself. Nor Sharp, solicitor, acting on behalf of Lord Harry James Potter. I am filing a standing petition on behalf of my client, requesting formal recognition of his right to be present in this chamber as a holder of 61 restored Wizengamot seats, pending a majority determination. I am also raising a preliminary objection to the presiding officer. The chamber, which had been the particular kind of loud quiet that comes from 200 people trying to hear a conversation they're not supposed to be having, went properly silent. Dumbledore looked at Nor. Then at Harry, who had followed her to the central floor and now stood next to her with his document case and his green eyes and an expression of complete composure. Madam Sharp, Dumbledore said, and his voice was deep and warm and carried easily, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that tone was the first argument. The question of Lord Potter's standing is precisely one of the matters this session might productively address. I would suggest we proceed with the agenda and, with respect, Chief Warlock, Nor said, in the tone of someone for whom the phrase with respect was a technical term rather than an emotional one, my preliminary objection takes precedence over the agenda under Wizengamot Standing Order 14. The objection is to the presiding officer himself. As a named party in the filing under review, Chief Warlock Dumbledore has a material conflict of interest that disqualifies him from presiding over any session in which that filing is discussed. The silence in the chamber had a different quality now. Harry could feel it, the particular attention of people who had come expecting a managed presentation and were receiving something that didn't have a safety net. "I am named in the filing in an administrative capacity," Dumbledore said. "Still warm. Still measured. My signatures appear on documents in my capacity as Magical Guardian and Chief Warlock, both roles carrying. Your signatures appear on 61 unauthorized lordship transfers, 9 fraudulent estate authorization documents, 1 illegal indefinite detention order, and a series of vault access redirections that our filing categorizes as theft. Nor delivered this the way you deliver a financial report, factual, undecorated, devastating in its flatness. If the chamber would like, I can table the relevant documents for immediate review. They are also, as of 23 minutes ago, in the hands of every Wizengamot member via standard delivery, along with the restoration notifications for all affected family seats." A sound moved through the chamber. Not words, more the sound of people realizing simultaneously that the thing they'd assumed was a manageable problem was something considerably different. Dumbledore looked at the chamber. Harry watched him do it, watched the assessment happen behind those blue eyes, rapid and professional. He was counting votes. Working out who had received notifications that morning, whose family seats were on the list, who would be sitting in this chamber right now feeling the first cold drop of something that wasn't quite understanding yet but was getting there. "The objection to the presiding officer requires a procedural vote," said a voice from the tiered seats. Harry looked up. The speaker was a woman in her 50s, direct gaze, no-nonsense robes, the seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement visible on her chain of office. Amelia Bones, Harry recognized from the seating chart, head of the DMLE, known for being inflexibly honest in a system that preferred its honesty with a little flex in it. "Madam Bones is correct," Nor said. "I would ask for a show of hands rather than wand vote, as wand votes can be influenced by, show of hands is acceptable," Amelia Bones said. She didn't ask Dumbledore. She just said it, which was itself a statement about where her position was. "Those in favor of upholding the objection to the presiding officer," Nor said. Harry counted hands without appearing to count them. 63. Against the total chamber membership of 212, that was not a majority. But 30 of the seats were currently empty. Those would be the families whose lordships had been in Dumbledore's proxy control, seats that couldn't be used because the seats themselves had been essentially stolen. 63 out of 182 seated members was more significant than it looked. Dumbledore counted them too. He understood what the number meant, and Harry watched him make the decision, the choice not to fight this particular moment, because losing a procedural vote by a narrow margin was worse than conceding gracefully. "Given the unusual circumstances," Dumbledore said, "I am content to step aside from the presiding role for the duration of today's session, in the interests of demonstrating that this body's processes are beyond reproach." He rose from the Chief Warlock's seat with the measured grace of someone presenting a voluntary action that was actually a strategic retreat. "I would suggest Senior Undersecretary Marchbanks assume the chair." A small, ancient witch in the front tier rose. Harry had notes on Griselda Marchbanks, examiner, former department head, political centrist with a strong procedural spine. Not ideal, but workable. Nor had briefed him on workable. Marchbanks settled into the presiding chair with the comfortable authority of someone who had been in the room longer than the chair had. She looked at the central floor, at Nor and Harry, and then at the chamber generally. "We'll proceed with the standing petition first," she said. "Lord Potter's claim requires deliberation before anything else can be addressed productively. I suggest we take the documentation as tabled, allow 30 minutes for review, and hear arguments." She looked at Harry directly. "Young man. You may take a seat while we deliberate." "Thank you," Harry said. He went to the witness chair on the central floor, deliberately not the seats on the tier, which would have suggested he was asking for standing rather than exercising it, and sat down with his document case on his knees and waited. The 30 minutes of deliberation were the loudest silence Harry had ever sat through. The chamber wasn't silent, technically. There was a constant low roar of conversation from the tiers, the sound of 200 people reading documents, conferring with neighbors, sending rapid notes by the charmed sparrows that Wisengamot members used for in-session communication. Harry watched the sparrows, small bits of folded parchment animated into fluttering flight, and tracked their trajectories the way you'd read a weather system. Who was talking to whom? Which seats were leaning toward which other seats? Where the conversation clusters formed and what their body language said about the content. He was also watching Dumbledore, who had taken a seat in the chamber's upper tier, not the chief warlock's position, just a standard seat, positioned with the particular care of someone choosing where to be visible. He was talking to a wizard beside him in a low voice, and the wizard was nodding, and Harry couldn't hear it but could read enough of the body language to know it wasn't panic. Dumbledore was managing. Working the room from a seat, which was less effective than working it from a podium but not without resources. Then the first owl came in. It was large and official-looking, and it landed on the shoulder of a wizard in the third tier with the kind of authority that owls carrying Gringotts correspondence always had, and the wizard took the letter, opened it, and went very still. Then a second owl arrived. Then 3 more. Then a cascade of them, dropping out of the high chamber windows in 1s and 2s, each finding its addressee with unerring accuracy, and the noise in the chamber shifted from deliberative murmur to something with considerably more edge. Harry watched a witch in the 4th tier, older woman, Bones family by the seat sigil, open her letter, read it twice, and then look at the central floor with an expression that moved through confusion and into something that Harry recognized as the particular fury of someone who has been patient about something for a very long time and has just found out that their patience was being exploited. She stood up without waiting for the deliberation period to end. "Madam Marchbanks," she said. Her voice was not loud but it carried. "The Bones family seat has received a restoration notification from Gringotts Bank. I would like to understand why my family's vote has been registered as dormant in this chamber for the past 9 years when I am demonstrably sitting in it." "I have the same question," said a voice from the left tier. A wizard, younger, with the Longbottom seal on his chain. "My family's secondary seat, the seat my grandmother has been trying to locate for 8 years, is listed in this filing. The authorization document transferring it to proxy control is signed by," he stopped. Looked at the document. Looked at Dumbledore's seat in the upper tier. Then back at the document. "I need a moment." He didn't look like he needed a moment. He looked like he was doing the same thing Harry had done 3 days ago, standing in a round room with parchment on the floor, absorbing the shape of something that had been there all along, just out of the angle of view. Marchbanks rapped her gavel. Not sharply, firmly, the rap of someone establishing order rather than demanding it. "We will continue deliberating," she said. "Those who have received correspondence may review it. We will address questions in order once the deliberation period concludes." She looked at the clock. 12 minutes. The 12 minutes were very long. When Marchbanks called the chamber back to order, Nor stood immediately. "The standing petition rests on 3 points," she said, moving to address the full chamber rather than just the presiding chair. She was good at this, the full room pivot, making everyone feel individually addressed without losing the formal direction of her argument. First, under the Hereditary Magical Titles Act of 1803, lordship rights are active upon restoration, not upon majority. The restoration having been formally filed and authenticated, Lord Potter's seats are legally operative now. Second, the Goblin-Veela treaty under which the blood analysis was conducted grants the subject of the analysis standing in any British magical governance proceeding directly arising from the analysis results. Third, she paused, just briefly. Third, this chamber has, in the last 12 minutes, received confirmation from over 30 of its own members that their family seats were affected by the same mechanism that affected Lord Potter's. Their presence here is itself evidence of the filing's validity. The treaty standing is clear enough, said Madame Bones, from her seat. She'd been quiet since the owls arrived, reading, and she spoke now with the air of someone who had read carefully and arrived at a conclusion that she didn't especially enjoy but wasn't going to argue with. I'll move to recognize Lord Potter standing on the treaty grounds. We can argue the hereditary titles act separately. Seconded, said the Longbottom Wizard. His voice was steady now. He'd finished absorbing. The vote was 89 to 47, with the remainder abstaining. Harry's standing was recognized. Marchbanks looked at him. Lord Potter. You may speak to the chamber if you wish to do so. Harry stood. He picked up his document case, set it on the witness chair, and opened it. He didn't take anything out, he just wanted his hands free. He looked at the chamber, at all of it, at 200 faces in tiered seats looking down at a small boy in clothes that fit him reasonably well because Ragnarok's office had arranged that on the second day, understanding that presentation mattered. He spoke clearly, without rushing. 3 days ago, I had a blood analysis conducted at Gringotts under Goblin-Veela treaty law. I went in not knowing I had a vault, and came out with documentation of 61 stolen lordships, 11 systematically drained vaults, a compulsion ward that had been on my mind since I was 15 months old, and a monitoring construct reporting my location and magical activity to an external holder. He paused. I'm 9 years old. I've been living in a cupboard under the stairs in Surrey. And in 3 days, with the help of Director Ragnarok and Madame Sharp and Elder Mireille Fontaine of the Fontaine-Veela clan, I have managed to get the documentation in front of every member of this chamber. Another pause, measured. I'm telling you this not to make a point about what I've accomplished. I'm telling you this because if a 9-year-old can assemble this evidence in 72 hours, the question of why it wasn't assembled sooner is one this chamber needs to ask seriously. The silence that followed was not the managed quiet of a body waiting for its next move. It was the silence of people genuinely not sure where to look. Dumbledore spoke from his seat. He didn't stand, he didn't need to, his voice carried without effort. Harry. The name used deliberately, warmly, the address of a grandfather rather than a respondent. I owe you an explanation, and I owe this chamber one as well. What I did, what I chose, was done out of a belief, perhaps mistaken in its methods, that your safety required, with respect, Harry said, and he used the phrase the way Nor used it. Technically, the documentation in front of this chamber doesn't describe choices made for my safety. It describes financial authorization documents. Proxy control instruments. Vault access redirections. Compulsion wards. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. If you'd like to explain how a compulsion ward suppressing my ambition and curiosity was a safety measure, I'd be very interested to hear it. Something moved through the chamber, not quite laughter, but its functional equivalent, the sound of an entire room being shown that the Emperor is in fact wearing precisely the robes that the paperwork says he's wearing and not the ones he described. Dumbledore's expression didn't collapse. He was too experienced for that. He maintained the warm, measured, sorrowful quality that Harry had noted, and which he recognized now as the man's most effective tool, the suggestion that whatever he had done, he had suffered for it, and that suffering absolved the doing. The compulsion ward was placed at Hogwarts' request. As a standard, Hogwarts has no standing to place wards on children not yet enrolled, Amelia Bones said. She'd been very still, but now she was leaning forward with the focused energy of someone who had stopped observing and started prosecuting. Headmasters have authority over students in residence. You applied that ward in November 1981, 14 months before any Hogwarts enrollment would be relevant. The documentation shows your signature. What is the correct characterization of that, if not unauthorized magical alteration of a minor? The chamber didn't fill with noise. It did something more interesting. It filled with the particular loaded quiet of 200 people making individual calculations about what they'd just heard and what it meant for them specifically. Dumbledore looked at Amelia Bones. He looked at Harry. He looked at the chamber. And Harry watched him reach the conclusion, saw it in the tiny shift of his shoulders, the fraction of a breath that didn't quite release all the way, that the ground he was standing on had changed. He didn't flee. He was too composed for that, and too proud, and also too intelligent, fleeing a Wizengamot session he himself had called would have consequences that even he couldn't manage. He sat forward and he said, with the gravity of a man making a considered decision, I believe a formal inquiry is appropriate. I will cooperate fully with any investigation conducted by the DMLE. I have nothing to hide. He held eye contact with Amelia Bones as he said this, which Harry noted. Holding eye contact with the person you've just potentially committed to giving full access to your records was either genuine confidence or an exceptional bluff. I'll begin the formal inquiry process immediately, Amelia Bones said. Under DMLE authority, no specific Wizengamot authorization required. She looked at Marchbanks. I would also request that the Chamber vote on an emergency suspension of Chief Warlock Dumbledore's authority pending the inquiry's completion. So moved, said a voice from the tier. Seconded, said another, immediately. Dumbledore didn't object. That was the thing that Harry watched most carefully, the precise, deliberate choice not to object, which communicated that the objection would have cost him more than the motion itself. He sat in his seat in the upper tier while the Wizengamot of Magical Britain voted, 104 to 61 with the remainder abstaining, to suspend the authority of its chief warlock pending investigation. The gavel came down. Marchbanks looked at the chamber with the expression of someone who has presided over something significant and would like a moment, please, to simply breathe, but is not going to get one. The session will take a 15-minute recess, she said. Thereafter we will address the petition regarding the review of Sirius Black's detention. Harry sat back down in the witness chair. Nor materialized at his elbow, already making notes, her energy the compressed purposeful kind that Harry was learning to recognize as her version of excitement. The suspension vote passed with more votes than I expected, she murmured. 11 of those were families who received owls this morning, Harry said quietly. They voted the moment they finished reading. She glanced at him. You counted. While he was talking. She made a noise that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space. The Black petition is next. Madame Bones will carry most of it. She's been building a file on procedural irregularities in the Azkaban population for 2 years, she just never had grounds to open the Black case specifically. This gives her grounds. What does she need from me? Nothing, for the Black petition. You're the petitioner of record, but Madame Bones' DMLE authority is what makes it move. She paused. What she'll need eventually, what will make this unambiguous, is Pettigrew. Ragnarok's team is working on that. She looked at him sharply. How? The magical signature that anchored Dumbledore's monitoring construct on me, Harry said. It passed through a secondary relay, which Ragnarok's cursebreakers identified as a Ratanimagus. Unregistered. The magical signature is consistent with someone alive. He paused. They're working on a location trace. It's complicated because the relay was dormant, but, if they can locate Pettigrew, then Sirius's imprisonment falls apart in one step, Harry said. Because the evidence for his conviction is that he killed Pettigrew. If Pettigrew is alive, there was no crime, Nor said. She was very still for a moment. Then she went back to her notes with an urgency that had a different quality to it now. The recess was 15 minutes. Harry used it to sit quietly and think, which was his preferred method of using time that other people filled with movement. He was aware of the chamber around him, the conversations, the movement of people between tiers, the two separate groups who glanced at him with expressions he was learning to distinguish. The ones who were working out whether he was a problem or an ally. The ones who had already decided. He noticed Dumbledore leave his seat and move toward the chamber's rear door, not the chief warlock's door, the general exit, with 3 people close behind him. Not fleeing. Conferring. Harry watched the 4 of them cluster near the door and tracked the quality of the conversation from the body language, Dumbledore composed and directing, the other 3 listening and nodding. He was managing. Repositioning. When the session resumed, Dumbledore returned to his seat. He was going to stay. Harry had half expected him to leave, to cite health, or prior engagement, or the basic dignity of not sitting in a chamber voting on your own suspension, but he stayed. And Harry thought he understood why. Leaving would be absence. Staying, even reduced to a single backbench seat, was presence. Presence was information. And Dumbledore, whatever else he was someone who always wanted to be in the room. The Black Petition took an hour and 40 minutes and was largely conducted between North Sharp and Amelia Bones, with periodic interjections from chamber members and one extended procedural argument about the definition of emergency detention that Harry followed closely and which Nor won on a technicality that made the opposing counsel look briefly as though he'd been hit with something soft but firm. The outcome was a formal order for Sirius Black's case review, a temporary transfer from Azkaban to Ministry holding facilities pending that review, which was significant because Azkaban's Dementors were not conducive to the kind of coherent testimony that a review required, and the appointment of Amelia Bones as lead investigator with full DMLE authority. It was not a release. Harry knew that and had known it going in. The release would require the trial, and the trial would require Pettigrew, and Pettigrew would require Ragnarok's Cursebreakers to finish their location trace, which they had estimated at 3 to 5 days. But Sirius Black was going to leave Azkaban. Today, by tonight. He was going to be in a Ministry facility where Dementors couldn't reach him, where someone was legally required to feed him and provide medical care, where the specific brand of soul consumption that 12 years in Azkaban represented would stop, at least, getting worse. Harry sat in the witness chair and heard the vote pass and felt something move through him that was not triumph. Triumph was the wrong shape for it. It was more like the satisfaction of watching a piece of a mechanism slot into place. Not the end. A step. But a real step, on real ground, in the right direction. The session was adjourned at 12:47. Marchbanks came down from the presiding chair with the deliberate pace of a woman in her 90s who moved exactly as fast as she chose to. She stopped in front of Harry. She looked at him over her spectacles. "You've been in that chair for 4 hours," she said. "Yes." "And you're 9. "Yes." She studied him for a moment. "Your grandmother Augusta Longbottom was one of the sharpest minds this chamber has seen in 40 years, she said. She would have found today, productive." She moved past him before he could respond, which he thought was probably intentional. Nor appeared at his shoulder. "Dumbledore left," she said quietly. 10 minutes before adjournment. "I didn't see him go." Harry had. He'd watched Dumbledore rise quietly from his seat while Marchbanks was reading the final order, while every other eye in the chamber was on the presiding chair, and he'd walked through the rear door without looking back. Not hastily, nothing Dumbledore did was hasty, but with the unhurried purpose of someone who has decided that the next move needs to happen somewhere else. He didn't fight the suspension vote, Harry said. No. He didn't fight the Black Review. No. He stayed for the whole session and then left 10 minutes before the end. Harry looked at the door. He's not done. He's repositioning. To where? Nor asked. Harry thought about the monitoring construct, redirected, then removed, and about a man who had spent 9 years knowing exactly where a small boy in Surrey was at every moment. He thought about what it felt like to suddenly lose that signal. He thought about what someone like Dumbledore did when a piece of information he'd been relying on went dark. "He'll try to talk to me," Harry said. "He'll think he can explain. That he can, reframe it. Make me understand." He picked up his document case. He genuinely believes he did the right thing. That's not a performance. Which means he'll think a conversation can fix it. And when he tries? Nor said. Harry looked at the chamber one more time, the tiered seats, the presiding chair, the room that had been built to impress and had spent the last 4 hours being impressed upon. "Let him come," he said. "I'll be here." Outside, Diagon Alley was doing what Diagon Alley always did, moving, noisy, impervious to the weight of events happening within its buildings because Magical Britain's commercial heart was very good at minding its own business. Harry stepped out into the afternoon sun with Nor on one side and Mireille on the other, and the owls that had been circling since morning were still circling, carrying their sealed documents to the last few recipients who hadn't yet found out that the world had shifted 3 degrees while they were having lunch. His document case was heavier on the way out than on the way in, because Nor had added to it copies of the session record, the Black Review order, the standing recognition, the suspension vote. A paper trail of the morning's work, physical and authenticated and permanent. Where to? Nor said. Harry thought about Ragnarok, waiting in his office with a transcript. He thought about Mireille, who needed to brief her clan. He thought about the Cursebreakers, tracing a rat animagus through the residue of a dormant magical relay. He thought about a man walking through a door 10 minutes before adjournment, unhurried, repositioning. Back to Gringotts, he said. Ragnarok will want a debrief, and I want to know where his Cursebreakers are with the Pettigrew trace. They walked. Around them, Diagon Alley moved and murmured and did its own business, and nobody who passed them on the cobblestones knew that the chief warlock of the British Wizengamot had just been suspended, or that Sirius Black was leaving Azkaban tonight, or that 104 witches and wizards had voted to begin dismantling something that had been built very carefully over 9 years by a man who was very good at building things. Harry walked and thought and let the afternoon sun fall on his face, which was something he didn't usually have time to notice. He noticed it today. The debrief with Ragnarok lasted 2 hours and covered the session in procedural detail, the Black Review logistics, the financial implications of the lordship restorations for the families who had received notifications, and the current status of the Pettigrew location trace. The trace, the curse-breaking team reported, had narrowed the signature to a region of southern England. Approximate timeline to a specific location, 48 hours. Harry listened to all of it, asked the questions he had, and at the end of it said, he left early. Ragnarok looked at him. Dumbledore. Yes. 10 minutes before adjournment. He went somewhere with purpose. Harry looked at the desk. He's been operating on the assumption that he can manage outcomes. Today was the first session where he couldn't. He's recalibrating. To what end? Ragnarok said. I don't know yet. Harry met his eyes. But I want to know within 24 hours. Ragnarok looked back at him. I will make inquiries through our network. Gringotts has eyes in most places. He paused. One more thing. The Egyptian vault holders sent word this morning. They're aware of the filing. He set a piece of parchment on the desk. They want to know if you're coming. Harry looked at the parchment. Egypt. Magical sites in the Valley of the Kings. A holding that had never been accessed because the wards didn't let unauthorized people in, which meant they were waiting for an authorized one. He looked at Ragnarok. How long would it take? To travel and return? For days, if efficiently managed. Ragnarok's expression was neutral. It is not urgent. The Egyptian holdings are secure. However, what's in them? A pause. Our records suggest the Potter family used the Egyptian vault as a repository for certain, irreplaceable materials. Texts. Artifacts. Things that Dumbledore would have removed from the accessible vaults had he known about them. Another pause, slower. Things that would be very useful for someone in your position to have access to. Harry looked at the parchment for a long moment. Then he looked at the door, in the direction of the city above, where the session record was being transcribed and the owls were still flying in somewhere Albus Dumbledore was making his next move. After Pettigrew, he said. After Sirius is free. Then Egypt. Priorities, Ragnarok said, and the word held something that might, in a different kind of being, have been approval. Priorities, Harry agreed. He picked up his document case. Outside the office, the corridors of Gringotts moved with their usual efficient energy, carts and clerks and the distant rumble of something very deep beneath the stone. Above them, Britain was in the early stages of understanding what had happened today, and the understanding was going to continue to unfold for a long time. Harry went back to his room, laid out his documents in their ordered system, and began preparing for the 48 hours between now and wherever the Cursebreaker's trace was going to end. Somewhere in southern England, in a body that wasn't quite his own, Peter Pettigrew had approximately 2 days left before the map closed in. Harry thought he probably didn't know that yet. Chapter 4, The Black Dog and the Silver Hand. The trace came back in 31 hours, not 48. Ragnarok's lead cursebreaker, Sharpstone, was a goblin who communicated in the fewest possible words and had the particular competence of someone who had been doing their job for so long that excellence had stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like the basic minimum. He arrived at Harry's working office at 11:14 on the second morning after the Wizengamot session, laid a single sheet of parchment on the desk, and said, "Wiltshire. Village called Stowshed Hill. There's a family called Weasley." Harry looked at the parchment. A precise magical signature, a location coordinate, and a notation that read, "Subject is living in animagus form. Has been in rat form continuously for an estimated 9 to 11 years. Magical signature consistent with Peter Pettigrew, registered animagus, registration fraudulently listed as deceased, see attached." "He's been living as a family's pet," Harry said. "Yes," Sharpstone said. "For approximately a decade." Harry absorbed this. The specific horror of it was not something he dwelt on, there would be time for that later, and dwelling didn't move anything forward. The family. The Weasleys. Are they involved? No evidence of knowledge, Sharpstone said. Several children in the household. The rat appears to belong to one of them. The family appears, he paused, as if selecting his words from a very practical vocabulary that didn't normally include this kind of assessment. Ordinary. Not involved. Right. Harry looked at the parchment again. Does Amelia Bones know? Not yet. She needs to know first. Before anyone moves. If this goes wrong procedurally, he stopped. Restructured. If Pettigrew disappears before there's official witness, the case for Sirius's trial falls apart. Bones needs to be the one who finds him. Official DMLE recovery, documented and sealed. Sharpstone looked at him with the flat attention that was the goblin version of assessment. Agreed, he said, and left. Harry wrote to Amelia Bones. He'd sent 3 letters to her office since the Wizengamot session, each one answered within 2 hours. She was, he had determined, someone who treated correspondence the way she treated evidence, processed immediately, filed correctly, nothing left pending. He wrote briefly. Location, magical signature confirmation, the registered animagus records, and one line at the end, speed matters more than preparation. He's been running for 11 years. He'll run again. He sent it with the fastest owl in Gringotts messenger service, which was an eagle owl named with a goblin word he couldn't pronounce that roughly translated as point, named for how it moved through air. The reply came back in 40 minutes. Moving within the hour. Thank you. A.B. Harry didn't go to Stowshed Hill. He wanted to, in the way he wanted most things he decided against, clearly, with good reasons, and then set aside. Amelia Bones didn't need him there, and his presence at an official DMLE operation would have created questions about chain of evidence that he didn't want Pettigrew's defense counsel, if he ever had any, to exploit. He stayed in Gringotts and worked, which was what he did when waiting needed to feel like something else. Nora arrived mid-afternoon with a portfolio of documents that she laid out on the secondary table with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that the black trial preparation needed to begin before the capture was confirmed rather than after, because after would feel like rushing and rushing made mistakes. Walk me through the trial structure, Harry said. Full Wizengamot proceeding, Nor said, settling into the chair across from him. Madam Bones will prosecute. The defense will be whatever the Wizengamot appoints. Sirius doesn't have a solicitor of record because his imprisonment was never formally charged. We may want to arrange independent representation for him. Do it, Harry said. Who's good? A witch named Greengrass, Cordelia Greengrass. Retired now, but she was the best criminal defense solicitor in Britain for 30 years. She'd come back for this. Nor looked at him. She'll need to be briefed privately, before she meets Sirius. He's been in Azkaban for 12 years. He won't be, she stopped, chose her words. The documentation is straightforward. The client may be less so. Tell her that, Harry said. Tell her I said it. Nor looked at him slightly sideways. Why does it matter that you said it? Because I'm the petitioner of record and she'll want to know I understand what we're dealing with. He paused. And because whoever goes in to meet Sirius first needs to know that I don't expect him to be functional. 12 years in Azkaban with Dementors and no trial. He's going to be, whatever that does to a person. I don't need him to be coherent for the trial to succeed. The evidence stands without his testimony. Nor was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about him. He's my godfather, Harry said. Simply. As though stating a geographical fact. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite the professional neutrality she usually wore, something more personal, quickly suppressed. Right, she said, and went back to her notes. They worked through the trial structure for 2 hours. The evidence was airtight on 3 independent grounds: the lack of formal charges, the fraudulent emergency detention legislation, and the absence of any body at the supposed murder scene. Add Pettigrew's survival and the prosecution collapsed entirely, not just weakened, collapsed, the way a building collapses when the foundations are discovered to have never existed. Nor kept saying things like "this is clean and I've never seen a wrongful imprisonment case with this much documentation," and Harry kept nodding and thinking about a man in a ministry holding cell who had been a dog, or felt like one, for so long that being human again might feel like a foreign language. The owl from Amelia Bones arrived at 6:47 in the evening. Pettigrew in custody. Animagus reversal completed under official witness. Confession under Veritasurum, voluntary, surprisingly. He seemed, a pause in the handwriting, the gap of someone choosing a word carefully, relieved. Trial date for Black requested, soonest available. I've marked it urgent. Up. Harry read the letter twice. He folded it and put it in the same pocket as the Narcissa Malfoy letter, which he had not yet responded to, and which he had not forgotten. Pettigrew's in custody, he told Nor. She looked up from her documents. Confession. Voluntary, apparently. Under Veritasurum. Harry thought about that for a moment, about a man who had been living as a rat for 11 years, carrying a secret that would end him the moment it came out, and who had, when finally cornered, chosen to simply stop. He didn't waste time trying to understand it. When can we get Sirius into the trial? If Bones marks it urgent and we file the supporting documentation tonight, Marchbanks can schedule it within the week. Nor was already writing. There'll be opposition, there always is, in high-profile cases. Some of Dumbledore's allies in the Wizengamot will want delays. They'll vote for delays, Harry said, but they won't have the numbers. Not after the session this week. She glanced up. You're sure? The suspension vote was 104 to 61, he said. We lost 61 votes to people who were either Dumbledore's block or genuinely uncertain. Some of those will shift once Pettigrew's confession is public. People who voted to suspend Dumbledore as a procedural matter are going to feel differently about it when they understand that an innocent man has been in Azkaban for 12 years. He paused. File tonight. She filed tonight. The ministry holding facility where they were keeping Sirius Black was not a pleasant place, but it was not Azkaban, which was the meaningful distinction. No Dementors. A Medowitch on staff. Food that was food rather than whatever Azkaban served. Harry knew this from Nor's briefing and knew also that Sirius had been there for 4 days now, which was simultaneously long enough to establish that he wasn't going back to Azkaban and short enough that the 12 years before it hadn't begun to process. He went on the 5th day, with Nor and a letter from Amelia Bones granting access, and the ministry official who escorted them through the facility's corridors had the particular expression of someone who had been told they were bringing a child to see a long-term prisoner and had not been able to find a regulation against it and remained personally troubled by this. The visiting room was small and had a table and 2 chairs and a window that showed a courtyard where nothing was happening. Sirius was already there when they arrived, seated at the table, and he looked. Harry stood in the doorway for a moment before going in, taking the inventory honestly because Nor had been right that he needed to understand what he was walking into. 12 years of Azkaban. He was 33 but looked older, gaunt in a way that was structural rather than simply thin, with hair that had clearly been cleaned but not recently cut and eyes that had the quality of someone who had been looking at the same walls for so long that any new thing in the visual field required a moment to process. He'd been handsome once, Harry thought, there were the bones of it, the structure beneath the damage. He looked up when Harry came in. Something moved across his face, recognition, complicated and layered, happening in stages. He'd been told who was coming. He'd still needed the full second of seeing it to believe it. "Harry," he said. His voice was rougher than it should have been for a 33-year-old. "You look," he stopped. Started again. "You look like James. Around the eyes." He stopped again. Pressed his mouth closed. Harry sat down across from him. He looked at Sirius directly, not with the careful management of someone performing compassion, but actually looked, taking in the whole of him without looking away. "I know what happened," Harry said. "I've read everything. I know about Pettigrew. I know about the detention order. I know about what Dumbledore did." Something shifted in Sirius's eyes, the specific loosening of someone who has been holding a shape against water pressure for a very long time and has just been told they can stop. "He really did it," he said. Not a question. More like a statement that had been waiting years to be made. "I kept thinking, in there, the Dementors take your good memories first but they can't take the thinking. I kept thinking, he knows. He knows I didn't do it. And he let me." He stopped. "Yes," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. "How are you not?" He gestured, imprecisely, at the space between them. "Angrier." "I am angry," Harry said. "I'm just not angry in a way that's going to be useful right now." He paused. "We filed the trial petition. Pettigrew confessed under Veritaserum, voluntarily, which means his testimony is about as solid as it gets. Madame Bones is prosecuting your case herself. The woman who's defending you is named Cordelia Greengrass and she's apparently the best there's been in 30 years. Sirius was quiet. His hands on the table were very still, the stillness of someone who had learned in a place where stillness was survival that it was better to move slowly than to reach for something and have it taken away. "And Dumbledore," he said. "Suspended as Chief Warlock pending DMLE investigation. He left the Wisengamot session I attended before it adjourned, and no one's seen him publicly since." Harry watched Sirius's face while he said this. "I don't know where he is yet. Ragnar's working on it." "You call the director of Gringotts by his name," Sirius said. "He asked me to." Sirius stared at him for a moment. Then something changed in his expression, not quite a smile, the muscles for it not quite remembering the sequence, but something in the direction of it, genuine and helpless. "You're 9, he said. "Everyone keeps saying that," Harry said. This time Sirius did something closer to a laugh, a rough, abbreviated sound that clearly surprised him by coming out. "James would have, he'd have been," he stopped again, but differently this time, not because the feeling was too much, but because it was the wrong shape for words and he was working on finding different ones. "I know," Harry said. Because he did, in some way that was instinctive rather than intellectual. "Nor is outside, she's my solicitor. She needs to go through the trial procedure with you. And Greengrass will want to meet you tomorrow." He paused. "I just wanted to come first." Sirius looked at him steadily. "Why?" Harry thought about this honestly. "Because someone should have," he said. The room was quiet for a moment. "The cupboard," Sirius said, abruptly. "They told me, the facility Medowich, she asked about my living situation before they arrested me, as a, I don't know, standard something, and I mentioned I didn't know where you'd been placed, and she said the blood document had noted a," he stopped. His jaw set. "A cupboard." "It was fine," Harry said. It wasn't fine, Sirius said, and his voice had changed, harder now, something real and sharp underneath the damage. I was your guardian. I was supposed to. He pressed his hands flat on the table. The moment I'm out. The moment they release me, you're not going back there. Harry looked at him. He'd thought about this, had thought about it with the same practical honesty he applied to everything. A 33-year-old man 12 years out of Azkaban was going to need time before he was anyone's stable guardian. The Black Estate would need to be re-established. Sirius would need medical care, magical and otherwise. None of this was a reason to say no to what had just been offered, because the offer itself was the thing that mattered right now, not the logistics. All right, Harry said. Sirius looked at him as though he'd expected an argument and hadn't prepared for the absence of one. Just, all right. The logistics will sort themselves, Harry said. The offer is the important part. Sirius stared at him for another moment. Then he turned his head slightly to the side, an involuntary movement, the kind that happened when something hit you sideways and you needed a second to not show it on your face. His throat moved. He looked back. You're nothing like I expected, he said. What did you expect? I don't know. Something more, he made a vague gesture. Fragile. Given the circumstances. The circumstances are why I'm not, Harry said. Sirius absorbed this. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone putting something in a drawer to think about later. Then he straightened slightly, not the dramatic straightening of someone performing recovery, but the smaller, realer adjustment of someone deciding to be present. Right. Send in your solicitor. Nor's meeting with Sirius lasted an hour. Harry waited in the corridor with the ministry official, who maintained his expression of personal trouble throughout and eventually offered Harry a cup of tea, which Harry accepted because declining pointlessly was an inefficiency he'd trained himself out of. When Nor came out her expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it, the look of someone who had spent an hour assembling a picture from pieces and didn't entirely like what the completed image showed, not because it was bad but because it was very human and she had been working in law long enough that very human things required a particular kind of recalibration. He's coherent, she said, quietly, while the ministry official went to find another cup. More than I expected. The Dementor damage is significant. But the core of him is intact. She paused. He keeps starting to apologize and then stopping himself. For what? Harry said. For not being there. For being in Azkaban, as though that was a choice he made. She looked at the corridor wall. I told him that the legal situation required his energy elsewhere and the apologizing could wait. She looked back. He seemed to find that clarifying. Good, Harry said. She gave him a look. Do you ever respond to emotionally complex information the way a normal person would? What's a normal person's response? I don't know. Sighing, perhaps. Looking troubled. I'm troubled, Harry said. I'm just troubled in a direction. It moves faster that way. She looked at him for a moment longer with the expression she got sometimes, the one that wasn't quite professional assessment and wasn't quite something more personal but was somewhere between them. Then she pulled out her notes. The trial petition was accepted this morning. Marchbanks has scheduled it for Thursday. 4 days. That's fast. Marchbanks is 87 and has been on the Wisengamot for 60 years, and I think she's decided that if something is going to happen it had better happen quickly enough that she's present for it. She almost smiled. She's pushing for an open session. Good, Harry said again. Open session means public record. Means it can't be quietly revised later. Means journalists, Nor said. Which I know you know, I just want to name it. Let them come, Harry said. The more witnesses the better. The Narcissa Malfoy letter had been in his pocket for 4 days. Harry finally answered it on the evening before the trial, sitting in his Gringotts office with the documents cleared to one side and a fresh sheet of parchment in front of him. He thought about what she'd written, the careful, formal acknowledgement that her information was insufficient, and he wrote back in a style that matched hers, formal, direct, without performance. Madam Malfoy. I received your letter. I am willing to speak. Tomorrow afternoon, after the trial proceedings, if you are available. Gringotts has meeting rooms that are appropriately private. I would suggest bringing only yourself. H. J. Potter. He sent it and went back to his preparation. Her reply came in 40 minutes, which told him she'd been waiting. Agreed. End Malfoy. The trial of Sirius Orion Black was held in courtroom 1 of the Ministry of Magic on a Thursday morning that was bright and cold, the kind of autumn day that felt like the weather was paying attention. The public gallery was full before the doors opened. Word had traveled in the particular way that significant things traveled in magical Britain, which was to say everywhere and immediately, by owl and flo and the specific magical equivalent of people calling each other and saying "Did you hear?" Harry sat in the gallery with Nor, which was where the petitioner of record belonged rather than the central floor. Cordelia Greengrass was on the central floor with Sirius, and Harry looked at her, late 60s, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent 40 years refusing to take up less space than she occupied, and felt the particular satisfaction of having made a good choice. He looked at Sirius. For days in ministry custody with a Medowitch and actual food had made a difference that was visible but not dramatic, like watching a plant after the first real watering. The damage was still there, structural and significant. But he was sitting upright, in clean robes that Gringotts had arranged because the Black family estate was technically under Harry's lordship authority and Harry had authorized it, and his eyes when they found Harry in the gallery were clear. He held Harry's gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, very small. Harry nodded back. The session was called to order. Marchbanks presided. The prosecution opened with Pettigrew's Veritasrum confession, read into the record by Amelia Bones in a voice that was completely flat and somehow that much more devastating for it, the quality of someone reading something that speaks entirely for itself and knows it. Peter Pettigrew had not been a Death Eater out of belief, the confession revealed. He had been a coward who had been afraid of Lord Voldemort and more afraid of saying no than of betraying his friends, and he had spent 11 years living as a rat in a child's bedroom rather than face what he had done, and when Amelia Bones had come to Stoteshed Hill with 6 Aurors and cornered him in a garden, he had turned back into a person and started talking before anyone had even reached for the Veritasrum, because he had been carrying it for 11 years and he was, it seemed, exhausted. The chamber was very quiet while the confession was read. Harry watched faces in the public gallery, people he didn't know, witches and wizards who had believed for 12 years that Sirius Black was a mass murderer, hearing the thing that changed that. He watched them process it. Watched some of them look at Sirius. The defense called 2 witnesses, the Hogwarts-era teacher who had taught both Sirius and Pettigrew and could speak to Pettigrew's animagus capability and his known cowardice, and a magical forensics specialist who testified that the evidence at the Muggle Street scene was consistent with an animagus transformation creating a distraction and escape rather than a death. Amelia Bones called no witnesses beyond the confession. She didn't need to. The Wisengamot deliberated for 22 minutes. Harry had expected longer. He'd prepared himself for longer, for the slow grind of institutional caution, for the possibility of a hung vote or a conditional verdict or some other compromise shape. 22 minutes meant it wasn't close. He didn't let himself feel relieved until the result was announced because feeling things before the thing happened was a way of borrowing certainty you hadn't earned yet. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the clerk read, "The Wisengamot of Magical Britain finds the defendant Sirius Orion Black, not guilty." The gallery made noise. Not a cheer, more the sound of a room full of people exhaling all at once, the particular sound of a held breath collectively released. On the charge of treason against the British magical community, not guilty. On all remaining charges, not guilty. 3 counts. Each one the same answer, and with each one the room got louder, the held breath becoming something else, something that had more relief in it than Harry had anticipated from a room full of strangers. He looked at Sirius. Cordelia Greengrass had leaned over to say something to him, and Sirius was nodding, and his face had done the thing that faces did when the thing they'd been waiting 12 years for actually happened, not dramatic collapse, not triumph, but the particular stunned stillness of someone standing in a place they hadn't been sure they'd ever reach. Then Sirius looked up and found Harry in the gallery again, and this time he didn't just nod. He smiled. It was rough and lopsided and clearly hadn't been used in 12 years, and Harry thought it was probably the best thing he'd seen since Mireille Fontaine had sat down in a corner chair in a Gringotts office and opened a book she wasn't really reading. Harry smiled back. Briefly, privately, before the room's attention shifted to the formal release proceedings, and Nor was saying something in his ear about the paperwork, and Marchbanks was calling for order with her gavel, and the morning turned into its next thing. The meeting with Narcissa Malfoy happened in a Gringotts private room at 3 o'clock, as arranged. Harry arrived 3 minutes early. She arrived exactly on time, which told him something about her. She came alone, as he'd asked, in robes that were expensive and understated in the specific way that said, "I know you know these cost a great deal of money and I am not going to draw attention to it," which was its own kind of statement. She was beautiful in the cold, composed way of someone who had made peace with the fact that beauty was a tool and chosen to be very skilled with it. She looked at Harry the way people who were doing rapid calculations always looked at things, taking inventory without appearing to. She sat across from him. She did not perform warmth, and he respected that. "Lord Potter," she said. "Madame Malfoy," he said. A beat of silence. She was deciding how to begin, he thought, and he let her, because how she chose to open would tell him more than the content. "My family's secondary lordship," she said. "The one returned in your filing. My husband doesn't know I'm here." "I assumed," Harry said. "He would call this weakness," she said. "Coming to you. Is it?" She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "It's information management. He doesn't have all the relevant information, therefore his assessment of the correct response is based on an incomplete picture." "What information doesn't he have?" "That the filing is airtight," she said. "He believes it can be challenged. He has been advised, by someone whose advice has historically been reliable, that the political situation will stabilize and that the filing will be quietly managed." She paused. "I believe that advice is wrong." Harry looked at her. "Because Dumbledore is the one giving it." Something moved in her face, very small, quickly controlled. "Possibly. He's been managing your family's relationship with political realities for a long time," Harry said. "Not just mine. He has been managing a great many things," she said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has an opinion and has made a professional decision not to express it yet. "I am here because the families affected by the filing are going to need to take a position. My husband will take the wrong one if left to his current information. And you're going to correct his information." "I'm going to correct mine first," she said. "Which is why I'm here." She looked at him directly. "What do you want from the affected families?" Harry considered this. Not what he was going to say, he'd thought about that already, but the specific timing of it, because timing in a conversation was as strategic as timing in a Wisengamot session. "Nothing coerced," he said. "I have the legal restoration regardless of whether any of the affected families are cooperative. The lordships are mine. The vaults are mine. The Wisengamot seats are mine." He paused. "What I want from the affected families is a straightforward accounting of what they knew, when they knew it, and a clear-eyed decision about which direction they're facing." "And if a family knew more than they should have," she said. "That depends on what they did with the knowing," he said. "People who were used make different decisions than people who were complicit. I don't need to pretend I can't tell the difference." Narcissa looked at him for a long moment. The room was quiet. Outside it, the bank moved in its usual efficient way, indifferent to the specific conversation happening in one of its private rooms. Lucius, she said, finally, was not told the source of certain financial arrangements. He knew they were irregular. He chose not to examine them. She held Harry's gaze. I knew they were irregular and I examined them more than he did and chose not to act. That is the honest version. Harry absorbed this. Why are you telling me that? Because you said you can tell the difference, she said. And I want to know if you were correct. He looked at her steadily. What you just told me puts you at personal risk, he said. You came here alone. You told me the honest version before I asked for it. That's not what someone does who is here to manage damage on behalf of a family that was complicit. He paused. You're here because you've decided to be facing a particular direction and you needed someone to know it. The silence that followed was a different quality of quiet than the one before it. Something in Narcissa's posture settled, barely perceptibly, the microscopic shift of someone who had been holding tension against an uncertain outcome and had just received a sufficient response. The Black Estate, she said. Serious. He's free, Harry said. Acquitted this morning. Full restoration of the Black Lordship follows automatically. He'll be Lord Black, she said. Yes. He and my husband have not spoken since 1981, she said. I know. Draco, she said, just the name, like placing an object on the table, is 3 years old. He's going to grow up in a world that looks very different from the one my husband has been preparing him for. She looked at her hands on the table, briefly, then back up. I would like him to grow up with accurate information about that world. Harry looked at her for a moment. He thought about the compulsion ward, the thing on his own mind that had tried to make him compliant and careful and small. He thought about children growing up inside carefully managed realities constructed by people who believed they knew best. That's a reasonable thing to want, he said. It is, she agreed. She stood, straightening her robes with the precise movements of someone who had made a decision and was done deliberating. Lord Potter. This has been, she paused, selecting her word. Useful. Madame Malfoy, he said. She moved to the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. The advice my husband is receiving, she said, without turning around. About the filing being manageable. About the political situation stabilizing. Another pause. It came in a letter. From outside Britain. She glanced back, just a fraction. I thought you should know. Then she was gone. Harry sat in the empty room for a moment. He thought about a letter from outside Britain. He thought about a very old man who had left a Gringotts session 10 minutes before adjournment and not been seen publicly since. He thought about a man who genuinely believed he was good, who had spent decades being the most informed person in any room, who had lost that position for the first time in a very long time and was, repositioning. He left the meeting room and went back through the bank's corridors to Ragnar's office. He didn't knock. He'd stopped knocking 3 days ago and Ragnar had never once looked up from his desk with anything other than the expectation of someone who had heard him coming. Dumbledore is outside Britain, Harry said. Ragnar set down his quill. Our network had him in France as of yesterday, he said. Specifically, near Beauxbatons. Harry looked at him. Near Beauxbatons, he said. Yes. Where the Delacour family has connections, Harry said. Yes. He's not running, Harry said. He sat down in the chair across from Ragnar's desk, the chair that had effectively become his. He's building something. He's lost Britain, or he thinks he has, and he's smart enough to treat that as real, so he's moving to his next arrangement. The question is what he expects that arrangement to give him, Ragnar said. Harry thought about it. Legitimacy, he said. Political cover. A way back in that doesn't look like what he lost. He paused. He knows we're going to come after the financial reclamation next. The stolen amounts. He needs resources and allies he can access from outside British jurisdiction. He looked at Ragnar. How fast can we move on the financial reclamation filing? The documents are already drafted, Ragnar said. I anticipated the question. He produced a bound folder from his desk drawer. International filing. Goes to the ICW Financial Governance Body. We can send it tonight. Harry took the folder. Opened it. Read the first 3 pages. This covers the redirected vault amounts. And the lordship management fees that were improperly charged to the estates during the period of proxy control, and the interest on both, compounded annually. Ragnar's voice carried the precise satisfaction of someone who had calculated those interest figures himself. The total is somewhat larger than the number I showed you on the first day. Harry looked at the total. He didn't react to it. He'd learned, over the past week, that reacting to numbers was a way of giving them power over you that they didn't need to have. File it tonight, he said. I'll have it sent within the hour, Ragnar said. Harry set the folder back on the desk. He looked at the window. The Gringotts' private offices didn't have windows to the street, just magical light, but he looked toward where the street would be, where the city would be, where Britain was continuing to process a week that had cracked several things it had believed were permanent. He's going to reach out to Mireille's clan, Harry said. The Fontaine clan is between him and Beauxbatons in every way that matters. He'll try to find a point of contact, a way to open a conversation about, he stopped. Thought. About me. Ragnar looked at him. He thinks if he can talk to someone I trust, Harry said, he can find a way to reframe what happened. Not to me directly, not yet. But to people around me. He stood. I need to warn Mireille. She is already aware, Ragnar said. She sent word this afternoon. She says, and I quote, "Tell the boy that if Dumbledore tries to use me as a conduit, I will ensure the conversation is held with several witnesses and transcribed." Harry looked at Ragnar for a moment. Then he said, I like her very much. I know, Ragnar said. She said the same about you. She said it in the tone people use when they find a fact mildly inconvenient. Harry left Ragnar's office and walked back through the bank toward the residential level, past the hum of the wards and the quiet efficiency of the late-evening staff, and he thought about a man in France near Beauxbatons, writing letters, making plans, repositioning. He thought about a Veela elder who smelled something wrong in a street and walked into a bank and changed everything. He thought about Sirius Black, right now, wherever they'd put him tonight, a ministry medical facility first, then the Black estate once the restoration paperwork cleared, which would be tomorrow, which meant tomorrow Sirius Black would sleep in his own house for the first time in 12 years. He thought about Narcissa Malfoy walking through a door and pausing and saying I thought you should know and then leaving before he could respond. He thought about France. He lay down on the cot in his Gringotts room, his room now, genuinely his, with documents on the desk and a window that showed the magical light of the bank's deep interior, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the next thing. There was always a next thing. He discovered that this week, viscerally and completely, resolution of one thing didn't create stillness, it created momentum, and momentum moved you forward whether you were ready or not. He was ready. He closed his eyes and thought about Egypt, about vaults that predated modern magical governance, about wards that recognized the authorized and turned away the unauthorized, about a family library that a very careful man had tried to have destroyed and had not succeeded in reaching. After Pettigrew, he'd told Ragnar. After Sirius is free. Pettigrew was in custody. Sirius was free. There were still things here that needed his attention, the financial reclamation, Dumbledore's movements, Narcissa's information, the restoration logistics for 61 lordships. But some of those could move without him standing over them. Ragnar and Nor and Amelia Bones were not people who needed managing. They were people who needed direction and then space to execute. He thought about the things Sharpstone had said about the Egyptian holdings, things that would be very useful for someone in your position to have access to. He slept on it. In the morning, he was going to ask Mireille how quickly they could get to Egypt. Chapter 5, Veela, Vaults, and Visiting Hours. Egypt in October was hot in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the quality of the light, heavy and ancient and completely indifferent to the people moving through it, the way truly old places were indifferent, having seen enough of human activity to have stopped finding it remarkable. The Valley of the Kings sat under that light like something that had always been there and intended to continue being there long after everything built on top of it had crumbled, and Harry stood at the edge of the site in the early morning with sand on his boots and felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely small in a way that had nothing to do with being underfed or overlooked. It was a good kind of small. The kind that reminded you that the world was larger than whatever problem you were currently standing in the middle of. Mireille stood beside him, wearing robes suited to the climate and a broad-brimmed hat that was doing its actual job, which was more than could be said for Harry's, which he kept forgetting to keep on his head. She had arranged the trip with the particular efficiency of someone who had been traveling magically for 6 decades and had stopped treating logistics as anything other than a list to be completed. "The site guardian will meet us at the entrance point," she said. "He's been expecting us for some time, apparently." The Egyptian magical community received notification of the blood test filing within 48 hours of it being sent. "They knew before I did," Harry said. "They knew your family had a legitimate heir," she said. "They've been waiting for one." She glanced at him sideways. "Don't let it go to your head." "I'll try," he said. The entrance point was not marked on any tourist map. It was a section of rock face in the valley wall that looked entirely like every other section of rock face until you were within 3 meters of it, at which point something in the stone recognized something in Harry's blood. He felt it, a deep resonant hum that started in his chest and moved outward, like a bell being struck, and the rock shifted. Not dramatically. Not with a great grinding of ancient stone. It simply became a door. Became a corridor beyond the door, lit by a light source he couldn't immediately identify, cool and steady, the air inside carrying the particular quality of a space that had been carefully maintained for a very long time. The site guardian was waiting inside. He was Egyptian, 70 or so, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of desert sun into something more like carved stone than skin. He wore robes that Harry recognized, from Ragnarok's briefing materials, as the formal dress of the Egyptian Magical Heritage Authority, an independent organization that operated parallel to the ministry structure the way Gringotts operated parallel to the British ministry, beholden to its own laws rather than the political weather of whoever was currently in charge. His name was Rashid Khalil, and he looked at Harry the way the rock face had looked at him, with a recognition that was more foundational than personal, the acknowledgement of something that had been anticipated rather than something that had simply arrived. "Lord Potter," he said, in English that carried the particular precision of someone who spoke 6 languages and had chosen his words in this one very carefully. "We have been preparing for your visit for approximately 2 days. Your vaults are ready." "Thank you," Harry said. "How many are there?" 3, in this site, Rashid said. "They are connected. The outer 2 contain objects, artifacts, primarily, some of considerable significance. The inner vault contains the library." He paused. "The library is the reason the Potter line established holdings here. The objects are additional." "What kind of objects?" Rashid smiled for the first time, briefly and with evident private amusement. "The kind that responsible families keep somewhere that is not easily found by people who might misuse them." He turned and began walking down the corridor. "Your great-great-grandfather visited in 1923. He said something very similar to what I imagine you are thinking." "Which was?" "He said, I appreciate caution in principle but I'd rather know what I'm dealing with." Rashid glanced back. "He was told, as I am telling you now, that you'll know when you see it." The outer vault opened on Harry's presence alone. The wards didn't require a key or a word or a ritual, just the blood recognition that had started the moment he'd come through the entrance. Inside was a space considerably larger than the corridor suggested it should be, lit by the same sourceless light, with shelves that ran from floor to ceiling along 3 walls. He walked through it slowly. Mireille stayed near the entrance, not because she wasn't welcome but because the vault was recognizably his in a way that the corridor wasn't, and she was not someone who crowded space that belonged to someone else. He looked at the shelves. Some of the objects were familiar in category if not in specific form, one making materials, potions components preserved in stasis jars, several boxes that carried the faint warmth of active protection charms. Some were clearly heirlooms, a set of dueling armor in an old style, a mirror with a frame carved in knotwork that shifted when he looked directly at it, a collection of wands in individual cases with cards noting the names of their owners and the dates of acquisition. He stopped in front of the wands. 14 of them. Each card handwritten in a different hand, spanning, he did the arithmetic from the dates, roughly 4 centuries. He read the names without recognizing most of them, because his knowledge of his family's history was still full of gaps, rooms he hadn't yet walked through. But near the bottom of the collection, 2 cards that he recognized the names on. Charles Potter. And beside it, Doria Potter née Black. His grandparents. Their wands, preserved after death, the way some magical families preserved wands as a record of lineage. He looked at them for a long moment and felt something that was specific and quiet, not grief exactly, because you couldn't grieve people you'd never known, but the particular weight of understanding how much had been taken from him before he was old enough to take anything for himself. He moved on. Found what he was looking for in the second vault. The second vault was smaller and contained fewer objects, but each one had the particular quality of something that had been put somewhere safe because it was genuinely dangerous. Not dark, none of the objects gave him the crawling wrongness of dark magic, but powerful in ways that required context before they were safe to use. A compass that appeared to show something other than magnetic north. A set of scales that Rashid, appearing at Harry's shoulder with the timing of someone who had clearly done this tour before, identified as truth scales. They measure the comparative weight of statements, not objects. Very useful in negotiations. Frequently misused. A cloak. It was folded on a shelf by itself, in a case of its own, and it didn't look remarkable until Harry reached out and touched it, and the nothing remarkable quality of it became something else entirely. The deliberate, engineered not remarkableness of something that had been specifically made not to draw attention, which was its own kind of remarkable when you knew to look for it. He picked it up. Let it unfold in his hands. It was lighter than anything he'd ever held, and when he draped it over his arm a section of his arm disappeared. Not hidden under fabric, gone, as completely as if it had ceased to be, with no telltale shimmer or distortion that any detection charm would catch. That, Rashid said, from beside him, with a tone of elaborate casualness, has been in the Potter family for approximately 5 centuries. We were asked to store it here rather than in the British vaults in 1975, when your grandfather became concerned about, he paused. The political climate. He was concerned someone would take it, Harry said. He was concerned someone would notice it, Rashid said, which was a meaningfully different thing. Harry looked at the cloak in his hands. He thought about Dumbledore, about the monitoring construct, about a man who had tracked his location and magical output for 9 years, who had presumably known about the British vaults in some detail because he'd been signing authorization documents for them. He thought about a vault that had never been breached because the wards didn't let unauthorized people in, and he thought about his grandfather putting something in this vault specifically so that someone with access to the British holdings couldn't reach it. He folded the cloak carefully and put it in the interior pocket of his robes, where it disappeared from view with a completeness that shouldn't have been possible given the physics of pocket space but apparently was when you were dealing with a cloak that had been specifically engineered not to exist visually. The library, Harry said. The inner vault was a library in the same way that the ocean was a collection of water, technically accurate and fundamentally inadequate. It was larger than any of the rooms at Gringotts Harry had worked in, lit by floating lights that adjusted to wherever you were looking, with shelves that went up 20 feet and a rolling ladder on each wall and a central reading area with a table large enough for 8 people and chairs that were inexplicably comfortable despite being several hundred years old. Harry stood in the entrance and looked at it and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the specific satisfaction of a person who reads encountering a space that has been built specifically for reading and contains enough material to occupy them for considerably longer than the afternoon. He walked the perimeter slowly, reading spines. The collection was organized, not by subject or date, but by a system he didn't immediately recognize and then realized, as he kept walking, was organized by application. Not this is a book about transfiguration, but this is a book about transfiguration as applied to healing, shelved near healing as applied to structural magic near structural magic as applied to warding. The whole library was a web of practical connections, each book linked to its neighbors not by category but by use. It was how he thought. He stopped in front of a shelf and felt, obscurely, like he'd walked into a room that someone who shared his brain had built for him. Mireille had come in behind him. She was moving along the opposite wall with the careful attention of someone who recognized historical magical texts and knew how to look at them without disturbing them. She stopped in front of a section and was quiet for a moment. "Harry," she said. He looked across the library. "Come and look at this." He crossed to her. The section she was looking at was a cluster of books on a middle shelf, grouped together with a spine card in front of them that read, in handwriting he didn't recognize, "Family History, Primary Sources." She pulled a volume carefully from the shelf. It was thick, hand-bound, with a cover that had the Potter family crest embossed on it in faded gold. She opened it to the first page. A letter, handwritten, dated November 1979. Charles Potter to his son James, written in anticipation of the latter's marriage to Lily Evans of Cokeworth. Harry sat down at the reading table. He opened the letter carefully. He read it. He didn't say anything when he finished. He turned to the next page. Another letter, James to Sirius, undated, apparently written sometime in 1980 based on the contents. Then Lily's handwriting, precise and warm at once, a letter to her sister that had clearly never been sent. Then more, a journal, his grandmother Doria's, running from 1955 to 1976 and covering 2 decades of magical Britain's political history from the inside of one of its oldest families. He read for 20 minutes. Then he looked up. Mireille was sitting across from him, watching him with the patient attention she deployed when something required time rather than direction. "He was going to tell me," Harry said. "About his father. When I was old enough. He wrote things down. Things he wanted me to know." He put his hand flat on the page without quite meaning to. "Dumbledore had these destroyed in the British Library," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd known this was why the Egyptian vault existed. Ragnarok's records indicate the British Family Library vault was cleared in November 1981, Mireille said quietly. The clearance was authorized by the magical guardian. "He destroyed my father's letters," Harry said. The room was quiet. "He destroyed them," Harry said again, and this time it was different, not an echo but a reckoning, the particular sound of someone identifying precisely what is unforgivable about a thing and naming it clearly. Not the vaults, not the lordships, not the compulsion ward. Those were things done to him. This was something done to his father, to the evidence of who his father had been, to the words James Potter had meant for his son and that Albus Dumbledore had decided Harry shouldn't have. Mireille didn't say anything. She understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed holding. Harry sat with it for a moment. Then he closed the book carefully, stood up, and began systematically identifying which sections of the library needed to be transported to Britain. It was what there was to do. The anger was real and it was his and it would be useful later, in the right direction. For now there was work. They were back in Britain by the following morning, arriving through a private portkey connection that Rashid's office maintained and that deposited them in the Gringotts secure arrival chamber at 7:15 with 4 crates of transported materials and Harry wearing a cloak that technically wasn't there. Ragnarok was waiting. This was not surprising, Ragnarok was always either working or waiting to work, and the distinction between the two states was primarily one of posture. He looked at the 4 crates, looked at Harry, and said, "Productive." "Very," Harry said. "The cloak is in my pocket." Ragnarok's expression moved approximately 4 millimeters. "The family heirloom mentioned in the 1923 inventory." "Yes." "Good." He moved toward his office. "Several things have happened in the last 24 hours. Come. The first thing, the International Financial Reclamation filing had been received by the ICW Financial Governance Body and had immediately triggered a review protocol that froze all assets held under Dumbledore's name in any ICW member jurisdiction pending investigation. This was standard procedure for the size of the claim, Ragnarok explained, and had happened faster than expected because two ICW governance board members had recognized names in the filing from other cases they had been separately investigating. Separately investigating, Harry said. Meaning Dumbledore's financial activity has come up before. In contexts that individually appeared unrelated, Ragnarok said. The ICW investigators are now understanding that they were not unrelated. The second thing, the Delacour family had arrived in Britain. Harry looked at Ragnarok. All of them? Not courtesies, Harry said. Considerably more than courtesies, Ragnarok agreed. She has been briefed by Mireille on the full situation. She is also, another pause. She has information about Dumbledore's movements in France that she appears willing to share but has not put in writing. She doesn't want it intercepted, Harry said. That is my reading. The third thing Ragnarok told him had nothing to do with Dumbledore or the Delacours. It was a letter, sitting on Ragnarok's desk in a plain envelope, addressed to Harry in handwriting he didn't recognize. He picked it up. Looked at the seal, not a family crest, just a plain wax seal in dark red. He opened it. Mr. Potter. I have been retained as independent counsel for Peter Pettigrew. My client wishes you to know that his cooperation with the DMLE has been complete and that he has provided information relevant to your situation that goes beyond the serious black matter. He has specifically asked me to inform you that there is a contingency arrangement he was made aware of, though not party to, that you should know about before you move to close the financial matters. He will speak with you directly if you are willing. He understands if you are not. M. Higgs, Solicitor. Harry read the letter twice. Then he set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Peter Pettigrew, who had lived as a rat for 11 years rather than face what he'd done, was asking to speak to him. About a contingency arrangement. About something Pettigrew knew about, was made aware of, but hadn't been party to. He thought about Dumbledore writing letters from France. He thought about Narcissa Malfoy saying I thought you should know on her way out a door. I'll meet with him, Harry said. Ragnarok looked at him. Not today, Harry said. Tomorrow. Arrange it through Madame Bones, I want the meeting on official record. The Delacour meeting happened at noon, in a private dining room at the Leaky Cauldron that had been reserved by the French Ministry's traveling secretary and subsequently re-reserved by Gringotts' legal division on grounds that the Leaky Cauldron's private rooms had better ward integrity than the French Ministry's traveling secretary apparently understood. Apollon Delacour was not what Harry had expected, though he'd been careful not to expect too precisely. Mireille was a Veela elder, composed, watchful, the particular quality of someone who had processed a very great deal of life and emerged from it without sentimentality. Apollon was younger, perhaps 40, with the Veela quality that Harry had begun to understand was not simply beauty but something underneath beauty, a warmth of presence that was almost physical, like standing in good light. She was also, he noticed immediately, very sharp. The warmth and the sharpness coexisted in her the way good wine could be both rich and clear at once. She looked at Harry when he walked in and her expression did the thing that Mireille's had done in the early days and that Sirius's had done at the ministry facility, the complicated recognition of someone encountering the gap between what they'd been told and what was actually in the room. Lord Potter, she said, in English with a French register that was smoother than Mireille's, less weathered. Please sit. Fleur, a seed's toy. The child at her side, a small girl with silver blonde hair and large gray eyes and the particular expression of a child who has been told to be on her best behavior and is finding this requirement somewhat limiting, sat down with elaborate care. She looked at Harry with unconcealed assessment. You're small, Fleur said. Fleur, her mother said. He is, Fleur said, unapologetically. Grandmere said he was important. Important people are usually big. Your great-aunt is a better judge of importance than size, Harry said, to Fleur directly. She told me I had very unusual magic and she was right about that. Fleur considered this with the serious deliberation of an 8-year-old evaluating new information. Then she nodded, apparently having decided it was a sufficient response to her observation, and turned to the bread basket. Apollon watched this exchange with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and relief. She gestured. I like her, Harry said simply. He looked at Apollon. Your aunt told me you have information about Dumbledore's movements. Apollon's expression shifted, the warmth remained but the professional clarity came forward. He came to Beauxbatons, she said. 2 days after the Wisengamot session. He met with the headmistress privately, she told me afterward, because we have an understanding. He presented himself as, she paused, choosing. As someone who had been the victim of a misunderstanding of significant proportions, who was seeking to establish a neutral base of operations while the matter was resolved in Britain. What did he ask for? Formally, nothing. Guest privileges, access to the school's library. Beauxbatons has the third largest magical library in Europe. He framed it as academic. She lifted her teacup with the precision of someone who was about to say something important. What he actually did, in the 3 days he was there before the asset freeze notification arrived and made his position less tenable, was speak to 11 people. Who? 3 were Beauxbatons faculty. 2 were French ministry officials. 1 was a representative of the Portuguese magical governance body. And 5, she set the cup down. 5 were members of the International Confederation of Wizards Governance Board. Harry looked at her steadily. He was lobbying the ICW board before the financial freeze. Yes. We don't know the content, these were private conversations. But the timing, and the people he chose, she spread her hands. The ICW Financial Review is governed by a board of 9. If 5 board members had already heard Dumbledore's framing of the situation before the freeze was imposed, the review process becomes complicated, Harry said. Considerably, she said. He is very good at framing. Harry thought about this. He thought about the ICW review and the 5 board members and a man who had spent decades being the most informed person in any room and who, when he lost that position in Britain, had immediately identified the next stage and moved to it with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been managing situations for so long that even setbacks had contingencies. The contingency arrangement, Harry said, almost to himself. Apollon looked at him. Pettigrew mentioned a contingency arrangement in a letter to me this morning, Harry said. Something he was aware of but not party to. Something he says I need to know before we close the financial matters. He looked at her. Dumbledore lobbied 5 ICW board members before the freeze. If the financial review stalls, the asset freeze has a 90-day review period, Apollon said. After 90 days, if no formal recommendation from the governance board has been issued, the freeze automatically lifts. If 5 of the 9 board members have been, she paused. Prepared, by a very skilled communicator, to view the case with a particular lens, he doesn't need to win the review, Harry said. He just needs to stall it. Yes, she said. Which gives him 90 days to manage outcomes from outside Britain, with his assets unfrozen, with access to resources we don't currently have a complete picture of. Harry sat back. He thought about Ragnarok's network and what it could reach inside the ICW structure. He thought about Amelia Bones and what DMLE authority looked like internationally. He thought about the 5 board members and whether any of them had a complete picture of what they'd been told versus what the documentation showed. The documentation, he said. Ragnarok's filing, how detailed was it on the specific financial mechanisms? The vault skimming methodology, the proxy control structure. Comprehensive, Apollon said. I reviewed a copy. There is no diplomatic way to put this, it is damning. But it's financial documentation, Harry said. It reads like bank records. Accurate, detailed, and technically convincing only if you understand what you're reading. He looked at her. The 5 board members he spoke to, if they heard his framing first, they'd read the documentation through that lens. Yes. So they need to hear a different account first. Harry thought. Not just the numbers. The human version of it. What was actually done to actual people? He paused. The compulsion ward. Sirius Black in Azkaban for 12 years without a trial. The destroyed family library. He said this last one evenly, and it was only because Apollon was Veela and could feel the particular quality of someone controlling something real that she registered it at all. Not as a legal argument. As testimony. Apollon looked at him for a long moment. The ICW Governance Board has a public testimony protocol, she said slowly. Any individual with standing in a filed case can request to address the board directly. It's rarely used because it requires travel to Geneva and the board controls the scheduling. She paused. But the Fontaine clan has standing in the filing through Mireille's countersignature. And the Delacour family has a formal relationship with 2 of the 4 board members who have not spoken to Dumbledore. Harry looked at her. She looked back. Something clicked into alignment between them, the particular moment when 2 people who have been approaching a problem from different directions find that their paths have intersected at the useful point. How quickly can you arrange an introduction to those 2 board members? Harry said. Within the week, she said. If we move immediately. Move immediately, Harry said. She nodded. Fleur, who had been eating bread with the focused dedication of someone who had decided that the adult conversation was not sufficiently interesting but that the bread certainly was, looked up at the tone of Harry's voice and assessed him again with those large grey eyes. Are you fixing something? Fleur asked. Working on it, Harry said. She considered this. Grandmere fixes things, she said. She says it is the most important skill. Your great-aunt is right about most things, Harry said. Fleur seemed to find this satisfactory. She returned to the bread. Peter Pettigrew was being held in a ministry-secure room that was considerably less comfortable than Sirius's facility had been, which Harry thought was appropriate without being smug about it. He arrived the following morning with Nor and Amelia Bones and a recording clerk, and Pettigrew's solicitor, a compact, cautious wizard named Higgs, was already there when they walked in. Pettigrew looked like someone who had been running for 11 years and had finally stopped and was now experiencing the specific exhaustion of not running anymore. He was thin and pale with restless hands and eyes that moved to the corners of the room reflexively before settling, with visible effort, on the center. He looked at Harry and flinched, not from fear of him, Harry thought, but from the specific guilt of someone confronted with evidence of consequences. Thank you for coming, Pettigrew said. His voice was thin. I wasn't sure you would. You said you had information I needed, Harry said. He sat down. Tell me. Pettigrew looked at his solicitor. Higgs nodded. Pettigrew looked back at Harry. When Dumbledore set up the proxy control structure, the Lordships, the vaults, all of it, he told me about part of it in 1981, Pettigrew said. Not the financial detail. He told me there was an arrangement to ensure that if anything happened to the war situation, if Voldemort came back, he swallowed. There was a secondary mechanism. A set of documents held by a third party outside Britain. If the primary control structure was ever compromised, the secondary mechanism was designed to reinstate it, Harry said. Pettigrew blinked. Yes. How did you? Lobbying 5 ICW board members before an asset freeze is imposed isn't just about stalling a financial review, Harry said. He's laying groundwork for reinstatement. If he can get the ICW review to come out in his favor, or even just inconclusive, he has a legal argument that the filing was improper, which could technically restore his proxy authority over the lordships while the matter is appealed. Nor, beside him, had gone very still. That's procedurally available to him, Harry said. Unlikely to succeed, but it doesn't need to succeed. It needs to take long enough to create uncertainty, and uncertainty creates room for a different kind of pressure. He looked back at Pettigrew. The third party holding the secondary documents. Do you know who it is? Not who, Pettigrew said. I know it's in Geneva. He always handled the ICW correspondence himself. He paused. There's something else. He looked visibly uncomfortable. He has a magical artifact. Something he's held for a long time. I don't know what it does, specifically, but he referred to it once as, the instrument that ensures the correct outcome. I don't know what that means. Harry filed this carefully. The instrument that ensures the correct outcome. He thought about a man who genuinely believed he was good, who had spent decades engineering outcomes, who would not describe any tool he used in morally neutral language. He would frame it as something that ensured things, something that served a purpose beyond itself. Do you know where he keeps it? Harry said. Hogwarts, Pettigrew said. Or he did. His office. He paused. It wouldn't be there now. He'd have taken it when he left. So it's with him in France, Harry said. Pettigrew nodded. Harry looked at Amelia Bones. She was already writing. Her expression was the focused intensity of someone who had been building a case and had just found the load-bearing piece she'd been looking for. The secondary documents in Geneva, Amelia said, to Pettigrew. If we can identify the third party, I can give you the correspondence addresses he used, Pettigrew said. He looked at his solicitor again. Higgs produced a folded sheet of parchment and slid it across the table. I kept them. I don't know why. I kept a lot of things. He said this with the exhausted quality of someone who had spent 11 years being a rat and had apparently spent that time in possession of better information management skills than his human years had suggested. Amelia took the parchment. She read it. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind her eyes did. I know this name, she said quietly. Who is it? Harry said. A Swiss magical governance official who has been on the ICW since 1978, she said. He sits on the Financial Review Board. She looked at Harry. He was one of the 5. The room was quiet. So the third party holding the secondary mechanism is also one of the 5 people Dumbledore briefed before the asset freeze, Harry said. That's not coincidence. No, Amelia said. That is a plan. Harry stood up. Thank you, he said to Pettigrew, and meant it in the direct, uncomplicated way he meant most things. Pettigrew looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. It came out simply, without the theatrical quality that apologies sometimes had when they were primarily about the person giving them. I know, Harry said. He left it at that. It was enough. Back at Gringotts by the afternoon, he spread everything across the desk and looked at it the way he'd looked at the original documents on the first day, not at any individual piece but at the pattern. Ragnarok arrived without being called, because Ragnarok had the ability to sense when a situation required his presence that Harry had stopped questioning and started appreciating. He laid it out. The 5 ICW board members. The Swiss official with the secondary documents. The 90-day freeze window. The unidentified artifact Pettigrew had described. The artifact, Ragnarok said. You think it has governance implications? I think he wouldn't describe it as the instrument that ensures the correct outcome unless it did something to outcomes, Harry said. Prophecy adjacent, maybe. Or something with authority, something that generates or validates governance documents. He paused. Or something that influences people. A compulsion artifact, Ragnarok said. The word landed in the room and neither of them needed to develop it further, because the logic was immediate and obvious and carried the specific weight of something that had been right in front of them all along. He put a compulsion ward on me at 15 months old, Harry said. He applied it like a standard tool. Something he knew how to use, something he was comfortable with. He looked at Ragnarok. The 5 ICW board members. Their conversations with him lasted 1 day each. Long enough for a skilled conversationalist to make a compelling case. Also long enough for someone carrying a compulsion artifact to use it. Ragnarok was very still. We need to know what that artifact is, Harry said. Before he uses it on the review board. He paused. Or finds out we're sending someone to Geneva. The Egyptian materials you brought back, Ragnar said slowly. The library. Yes, Harry said. You've been reading. All yesterday evening, Harry said. The Potter family had an ongoing interest in a specific category of artifact, influence and governance objects, things that operated on large-scale institutional authority. My great-great-grandfather wrote about them in a journal that ended up in the Egyptian library. He pulled a folded page from his document case. He transcribed the relevant section the night before. There are 5 known objects in this category. 3 are accounted for in public magical heritage collections. 1 was destroyed in the 17th century. He looked at Ragnar. The 5th one's known as the Concordat Stone. It doesn't compel individual people. It validates agreements, makes them magically binding regardless of whether the parties entered them with full knowledge or free will. Anything signed in its presence is treated by magical law as a freely made oath. Ragnar looked at the transcription. Then at Harry. If he has used it on governance documents, then some of what he's already done has magical legal weight that it shouldn't have, Harry said. Including, potentially, the ICW board votes on the financial review. He paused. We need to establish what he signed in front of that stone. We need to establish it before the 90-day window closes and before he uses it on anything else. The Swiss official, Ragnar said. He's the key, Harry said. He has the secondary documents. If those documents exist and were signed in front of the Concordat stone, they have apparent legal weight. If we can prove the stone exists and was used, we can have every document it touched reviewed for legitimacy. Ragnar looked at the desk. At the transcription. At the pattern Harry had assembled. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was making a significant decision. I have a contact at the International Confederation, he said. Someone who is not on the Financial Review Board and who has been, skeptical of certain governance trends, for several years. He paused. She would listen. Arrange a meeting, Harry said. She is in Geneva, Ragnar said. Then we go to Geneva, Harry said. Apollon Delacour wants to introduce me to the 2 unbriefed board members anyway. We can do both. He looked at Ragnar. How soon? 3 days, Ragnar said. I need to prepare the supporting documentation for your contact meeting and arrange the travel through secure channels. He paused. And I would suggest you spend part of those 3 days visiting Sirius Black. Harry looked at him. It wasn't what he'd expected Ragnar to say. He is now Lord Black, Ragnar said, with the particular neutrality of someone delivering a fact. He has taken formal possession of the Black estate. He has been there for 2 days and from what I understand, from the estate's account manager, he is finding the transition from ministry facility to large ancestral home somewhat. He searched for the word. Loud. Loud? Harry said. The house has a portrait gallery, Ragnar said. Several of the portraits are vocal. And the house elf has strong opinions about cleaning that he is apparently expressing at length. Harry thought about Sirius Black, 12 years in Azkaban, alone in a large house with opinionated portraits and an emphatic house elf. I'll go tomorrow morning, Harry said. I thought you might, Ragnar said. Grimmauld Place was not a cheerful building. It had the appearance of something that had decided long ago that cheerfulness was for buildings without history and had committed fully to the alternative. It sat between its neighbors with the compressed energy of a place that had accumulated a great deal of magic and sentiment over the centuries and was not entirely sure what to do with either. Harry knocked. The sound echoed in a way that suggested the interior was both very large and very empty. The door opened. A house elf with large eyes and aggressively folded ears looked at him for a moment and then said, with the intensity of someone who has been waiting for something to happen, "You is the young Lord Potter." "Yes," Harry said. "Creature is glad to see a young person," the elf said, with the emphasis of someone who had extremely specific thoughts about old people and was exercising considerable restraint. "Master Sirius is in the kitchen. He is eating toast." A brief pause. Again. Harry followed Creature through the house, which was large and dark and clearly in the early stages of being unneglected, dust sheets pulled from furniture in some rooms, windows forced open in others, the general evidence of someone doing a great deal of physical work very quickly the way people did when they needed their hands busy and their mind quiet. The kitchen was in the basement and was warmer than the rest of the house. Sirius was at the table with a pot of tea and toast and a copy of the Daily Prophet that he appeared to be reading with the focused attention of someone who had been away from news for 12 years and was now trying to absorb a decade's worth of it simultaneously. He looked up when Harry came in. He was looking better, not repaired, nothing about 12 years in Azkaban repaired in a week, but better in the way of someone who had been sleeping in an actual bed and eating actual food and had started to remember, cell by cell, what that was supposed to feel like. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Harry said. He sat down. Creature appeared with a second cup of tea, which Harry accepted, and disappeared with the particular expression of an elf who is pleased but not about to show it. Sirius pushed the Prophet across the table. "Page 6, he said. Harry looked at page 6. A short article, presumably written quickly from the Wizengamot session record, under the headline, "Child Lord Drives Historic Wizengamot Changes, Who is Harry Potter?" He read the first paragraph. It called him the 9-year-old heir. It called the filing unprecedented. It called the Dumbledore suspension shocking. It was mostly accurate, which for the Daily Prophet was its own kind of shock. "You've been busy," Sirius said. "Yes," Harry said. "While I was eating toast." "You needed toast," Harry said. "You spent 12 years in Azkaban." Sirius looked at him. There was something in his face that was becoming more legible by the day, the man emerging through the damage, feature by feature, as though he was remembering how to be himself. "I want to help," he said. "With whatever comes next. I'm not," he stopped. "I'm not going to pretend I'm fully operational yet. But I need to be doing something." Harry looked at him steadily. He'd thought about this. He'd thought about what Sirius Black at 33, 12 years damaged but fundamentally intact, could actually do versus what he might want to do versus what it would cost him to do it before he was ready. "Geneva," Harry said. "In 3 days, I'm going to the ICW headquarters with Ragnarok's contact and Apollon Delacour. It would help to have someone who can speak to what Dumbledore did as a first-hand witness. Not for testimony, we have Pettigrew for that. But as," he thought about it. "The difference between documentation and reality. Someone who was in the middle of it." Sirius looked at him. "You want me at the ICW?" "I want you somewhere you can choose to be," Harry said. "If it's Geneva, good. If you need more time, I'll find another way. It's not a condition." Sirius was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, at the tea, at the copy of the Prophet. Then he looked back up with something in his expression that was both more and less than it had been when Harry had walked in. "I'll be ready in 3 days," he said. "All right," Harry said. They drank their tea. Outside, Grimmauld Place's street was quiet in the mid-morning, and inside the house the portraits were mercifully silent for once, and the kitchen was warm, and Harry thought that this was something, not everything, not the end, not even close to the end, but something, that had been taken from him before he was old enough to know it existed and had now been, carefully and piece by piece, returned. He drank his tea and thought about Geneva. Chapter 6, Lord of 61. Geneva in November was grey and precise, the way cities that housed international institutions tended to be, built for permanence rather than charm, the architecture saying we were here before you and we will be here after with the quiet confidence of stone that had never needed to raise its voice. The International Confederation of Wizards headquarters sat on the southern shore of Lake Geneva in a building that appeared, to Muggle eyes, to be a minor administrative annex of the European Diplomatic District. To magical eyes it was considerably larger, the familiar spatial expansion of an institution that had been accumulating both physical and political space for centuries, its wards so old and layered they had become indistinguishable from the air itself. Harry arrived on a Wednesday morning with Ragnarok, Sirius, Mireille, Apollon, and Nor, through a portkey connection that deposited them in a secure arrival chamber 2 levels below the main building. The arrival chamber had murals on the walls, scenes from the ICW's founding in 1692, witches and wizards from a dozen nations gathered around a table, the specific visual language of institutions that wanted you to understand, from the moment you entered, that you were in a place of historical significance. Harry looked at the murals for approximately 3 seconds. "Ragnarok," he said. "What's the timetable?" "Your meeting with my contact, Madame Elka Brandt, ICW Transparency Officer, is at 9, Ragnarok said, moving without looking at the murals at all, because Ragnarok had been here before and had strong opinions about institutions that decorated their entrance halls with self-mythology. Apollin's introduction to the 2 board members is at 11. The formal testimony request, if we file it this morning, would be scheduled for tomorrow at the earliest. "File it when we arrive upstairs," Harry said. "It's already filed," Nor said, from his left. "I sent it through the ICW clerk's office by owl at 6 this morning. They have it." Harry looked at her. "You said move quickly," she said. "I did," he said. "Then it's filed." Elka Brandt was 62, Swiss, and had been the ICW's transparency officer for 19 years, which meant she had spent almost 2 decades being the person that large institutions reluctantly employed because external governance bodies required them to and then carefully ignored. She had, over those 19 years, developed the particular personality of someone who has been carefully ignored for a very long time, precise, patient, and in possession of a filing system so comprehensive that the institution she nominally served could not make a significant move without her knowing about it. She met them in a small conference room on the 3rd floor with the contained energy of someone who had been waiting for this meeting since Ragnarok's letter had arrived 4 days ago and had spent the intervening time doing her own preparation. She looked at Harry when he walked in and then looked at Ragnarok. "He's 9, she said, in English that was clipped and very clean. "Yes," Ragnarok said. "The filing is his." "Yes." She looked at Harry again with an expression that recalibrated rapidly and then settled into something more useful, professional assessment, clean of the assumptions she'd just been caught making. "Lord Potter," she said. "Sit down. I have questions and I imagine you have more." "Yes to both," Harry said, and sat. She had, as it turned out, already identified 4 of the 5 ICW board members who had met with Dumbledore before the asset freeze. She had done this by cross-referencing the building's visitor access logs, which were her domain, with the scheduling records, also her domain, and the board members' public calendars, which she'd been maintaining with the thoroughness of someone who found thoroughness personally satisfying. "The 5th contact wasn't a meeting in this building," she said. "It was outside. A restaurant on the Rue de Rive. I can place Dumbledore in Geneva on that date from the visitor logs. He came in to see the first 4. The 5th was," she produced a photograph, printed from a magical monitoring point on the street, the images moving in the small jerky loops of surveillance rather than portraiture. "Councillor Beaumont. French representative. He and Dumbledore had lunch for 90 minutes. And Beaumont is on the Financial Review Board," Harry said. "He is the chair of the Financial Review Board," Elka said, with the precise flatness of someone delivering a number that is both exact and devastating. The room was quiet. "Right," Harry said. "The Concordat Stone," Ragnarok said, to Elka. "In your capacity as transparency officer, do you have access to records of its use? Any documented appearances in governance proceedings?" Elka looked at him. "The Concordat Stone is catalogued as a destroyed artifact. ICW Heritage Records, 1703, destroyed in the Valencia Accord purge." She paused. "That is what the records say." "But," Harry said. "But I have seen 3 governance documents in the last 9 years that carry a specific magical authentication signature that should not exist on modern documents," she said. "An archaic ratification seal, pre-1700 magical notation, that shows up as a watermark under standard document analysis. I flagged it each time. Each time, I was told it was a harmless historical residue from the template used and was nothing to be concerned about. She opened a folder and slid 3 documents across the table. Each had a faint shimmer on the parchment, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you were looking for it. Harry looked at them. He'd spent part of the flight from Britain reading from the Potter family library materials he'd transported from Egypt, specifically, the great-great-grandfather's journal entries on governance artifacts. He knew what the Concordat stone's authentication mark was supposed to look like from the 1923 description. It looked like this. "These 3 documents," he said. "What do they do?" "The first creates a binding financial arbitration protocol that gives the ICW Financial Review Board expanded discretionary authority," Elka said. "Passed in 2018. The second establishes a precedent that governance review findings are non-appealable once approved by a 2/3 board majority." She paused. "The third is a retroactive validation instrument. It gives the board authority to validate or invalidate external national filings based on procedural grounds the board itself defines." Harry looked at the documents. He looked at Ragnarok. Ragnarok was looking at the documents with the expression of someone who has just been shown that a piece of machinery they thought they understood has an additional component that changes everything it does. "He built the review process," Harry said. "He didn't just lobby the board members. He built the mechanism the board uses to conduct the review, and made the mechanism's results non-appealable, and gave the board the authority to define what counts as a valid filing." He said this carefully, working through it as he said it. "The British filing, our filing, the financial reclamation, the lordship restoration, the board can review it and rule it procedurally deficient on whatever grounds they choose, and that ruling cannot be appealed. Not within the ICW's current governance structure," Elka said. "No. How long has he been planning this?" Sirius said, from the far end of the table. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd sat down, and it came out with the concentrated weight of someone who had been listening to every piece of this and fitting it against what he knew from a different angle. "At least 9 years, Harry said. "The second document, the non-appeal precedent, when was it passed?" Elka looked. 2017. 6 months before Sirius was arrested, Harry said. He was already building the international structure before he had to use it domestically. He sat back. He didn't design the proxy control system as a response to the war. He designed it before the war ended. Or during it. The war gave him the cover, everyone was focused on Voldemort, nobody was looking at governance procedures being quietly amended at the ICW. He looked at Mireille, who had been sitting very still. "How old is the Concordat stone supposed to be?" "Pre-Roman," Mireille said quietly. "The Veela clan records have references to it from the 2nd century. It was thought destroyed because that's what the person who had it wanted the record to say." "And now it's in France," Harry said. "With him?" "Yes," she said. Harry looked at the 3 documents on the table. He thought about a man who had built not one system but 2, the domestic British structure and the international structure above it, each designed to support the other, the domestic system creating the situation and the international system creating the conditions under which the situation couldn't be reversed. He thought about 90 days and a freeze that lifted automatically if the board issued no recommendation, and a board chair who had had lunch with Dumbledore for 90 minutes, and a review process that Dumbledore had helped design. He thought about the cloak in his interior pocket. He thought about the library in Egypt and the letters his father had written and that had been destroyed before he could read them. He thought about being 15 months old. "Elka," he said. "The 3 documents. If the Concordat stone was used to ratify them, if we can prove that, what's the legal status of documents ratified by a destroyed artifact through fraudulent means?" Elka looked at him. "Null," she said. "Under ICW Charter, governance documents ratified through fraud are null and void from inception. They never legally existed. Which means the review board's expanded discretionary authority never existed," Harry said. "Which means their non-appeal precedent never existed. Which means whatever they decide about our filing, can be appealed," Nor said, from beside him, in the tone of someone watching a net close from a very satisfying angle. Can be appealed, Harry confirmed. In an international court that Dumbledore has not had 19 years to prepare. He looked at Elka. We need to prove the stone's existence and its use on these documents. How do we do that? Elka opened her folder again. Article analysis, she said. A joint Goblin-Veela artifact authentication, similar to your blood test, I believe, can confirm the stone's authentication signature on the documents. It's ancient magic. It doesn't erase. Covering it would require destroying the documents themselves. And he can't destroy them, Harry said. Because they're in the ICW archive. Your archive. My archive, Elka said, with something that was not quite satisfaction but functioned like it. Yes. Can you arrange the authentication analysis? I can have it completed by this afternoon, she said. I've been waiting for legal grounds. She closed her folder with the decisive movement of someone who has been preparing a document and has just been handed the signature page. You have given me legal grounds. The meeting with Apollin's 2 board members, a Spanish witch named Coordinator Vargas and a Japanese wizard named Coordinator Tanaka, happened at 11 in a formal meeting room on the 5th floor, and it was different from every other meeting Harry had been in that week because it wasn't primarily a legal conversation. It was a human one. Vargas and Tanaka were not people who had been corrupted. They were people who had been kept uninformed, which was a different problem requiring a different approach. They had read the financial reclamation filing. They had the numbers. What they needed was what Nor had said, on the first day of trial preparation, not the legal argument but the human version. Harry told it. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic person and dramatic was not what this required. He told it the way he'd assembled it over 3 weeks, methodically, in order, with the specific human weight of each piece named clearly. The compulsion ward at 15 months. The 9 years of a cupboard under stairs. The monitoring construct sending his location and emotional state to a mirror somewhere else. The destroyed library. Sirius Black's 12 years in Azkaban. The 61 families receiving owls and discovering that their ancient seats had been in someone else's pocket. He told it in 15 minutes. He didn't perform emotion. The facts carried their own weight, and he trusted them to. When he finished, the room was quiet. Vargas was looking at the table. Tanaka had his hands folded in front of him and was very still. The 3 governance documents, Tanaka said, finally. We voted on all 3. Yes, Harry said. If the Concordat Stone authentication is confirmed, the documents are null, Harry said. Your votes were cast in good faith on documents that were fraudulently ratified. That is not your liability. He paused. It is his. Tanaka looked at him for a long moment. You're 9 years old, he said, not unkindly. I'm aware, Harry said. And you're asking 2 members of the ICW Financial Review Board to, I'm telling you what happened, Harry said. What you do with it is your decision. The room stayed quiet. Then Vargas looked up from the table, and what was on her face was something Harry recognized from the Wisengamot session, the expression of someone who has finished a calculation and arrived at a clear answer that they don't especially enjoy but aren't going to argue with. When the authentication results come through this afternoon, she said, I would like to see them immediately. I'll have them sent to your office, Elka said, who had accompanied them to the meeting and had been sitting very quietly in the corner. Within the hour of completion. Vargas nodded. She looked at Harry. The formal testimony request was accepted this morning, she said. The board session is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. She paused. Councillor Beaumont will be presiding. I know, Harry said. He will not, she stopped. Started again. He has a particular way of managing sessions. I know that too, Harry said. She looked at him. He looked back. She nodded again, once, and the meeting concluded. The authentication results came through at 3:15, while Harry was in the ICW's public reading room going through the Potter library materials he'd brought with him. Elka appeared at the reading room entrance with a folder and an expression that someone who knew her less well might have mistaken for calm. "Confirmed," she said, handing him the folder. "All 3 documents. The Concordat stone signature is present on each. The authentication magic is consistent with a 2nd century artifact, as per the Veela historical records Madame Fontaine provided." She paused. "There's something else." Harry looked up. "A 4th document," she said. "In a secondary archive. I found it during the analysis when the authentication magic flagged it automatically as consistent with the other 3. She pointed to a page in the folder. "It was filed 3 months ago. 2 weeks before the British filing reached the ICW." Harry read the page. It was a preemptive validation instrument, a document establishing that any filing concerning British magical inheritance matters received by the ICW in the 12-month period following the document's filing would be subject to mandatory review by the Financial Governance Board under the expanded discretionary authority established by Document 2, with results issued within 90 days and treated as final under the non-appeal precedent established by Document 3. The mechanism was so elegant it was almost architectural. The British filing had to go to the Financial Review Board. The board's decision was final and non-appealable. The board chair had lunched with Dumbledore for 90 minutes. And all 3 of the governance documents making this sequence possible had been fraudulently ratified by an artifact that the ICW believed had been destroyed 3 centuries ago. "He filed this 12 weeks before we did," Harry said. "Yes," Elka said. "He anticipated the filing. He knew the blood test was coming," Harry said. "Not the specific date. But he knew, if the monitoring construct was removed, or failed, or was redirected, he knew that eventually something would trigger an analysis. He built the international mechanism as a contingency before the domestic structure was compromised." He closed the folder. "He's been sitting on this for 12 weeks, watching the filing move through the process, knowing the board has the authority to nullify it." He paused. "He was going to let us get all the way to the review and then watch it collapse." Elka said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. "But the stone changes it," Harry said. "Send the authentication results to Vargas and Tanaka immediately. And to Amelia Bones in Britain, she needs it for the domestic investigation record. And," he paused. "Send a copy to Dumbledore's last known address." Elka looked at him. "To Dumbledore?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because tomorrow morning he's either going to be in that board session or he's going to be watching it from somewhere," Harry said. "Either way, I want him to know before it starts that the stone has been authenticated. I want him to come into tomorrow knowing that we know." He paused. "I want him to have to decide tonight what his next move is, because whatever he decides will tell us something about him that we don't know yet." Elka studied him for a moment. Then she took the folder back and walked toward the door. "Lord Potter," she said, from the doorway. He looked up. 19 years, she said. "I have been doing this job for 19 years. I have been waiting for the specific conversation we had this morning for approximately 17 of them." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you." She left. Sirius found him in the reading room at 5, when the building had gone quiet with the particular emptiness of an international institution after business hours, all its weight and ceremony stored somewhere internal until morning. He sat down across the reading table without asking and looked at the documents spread across it, the Egyptian library materials, the authentication results, Elka's 4th document, with the expression of someone who has been assembling context all day and has now arrived at a sufficient picture. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," Harry said. "Dumbledore. Is he going to be in that room?" Harry thought about it. He'd been thinking about it since Elka had left. "Yes," he said. "He'll come. He still thinks he can manage it. He's been managing things for so long that the concept of something he can't manage doesn't feel real to him yet." He paused. "And he wants to see me." Sirius looked at him. He said that? He hasn't said anything. But the monitoring construct, 9 years of tracking my location and magical state, every day. And then it goes dark. Harry looked at the table. I don't think he's thinking about the ICW board session as a political event. I think he's thinking about it as a place where he might be in a room with me. Because he thinks he can explain, Sirius said. He genuinely does. Yes. Sirius was quiet for a moment. I knew him, he said. Not the way you know someone you trust, I always felt something slightly off, looking back. But I knew him as a presence. Hogwarts. Order of the Phoenix. He was everywhere that mattered. He paused. He looked at James and me like we were, investments. Valuable and carefully managed and occasionally indulged but never quite, ours. Harry listened. And he looked at you, Sirius said, like you were a piece of something. A component. The symbol that everything else was built around. His jaw tightened. A baby. He looked at a baby and saw a piece of a strategy. He still does, Harry said. That's not changed. The strategy around me has changed because the circumstances have changed. He paused. He's going to come into that room tomorrow and he's going to try to appeal to me. Not to the board, not to the legal argument. To me, specifically, in front of everyone else. And? Sirius said. And I'm going to let him, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. The best thing I can do tomorrow is let him talk, Harry said. Because everything he says in that room is on the official record. And because the most important thing is not winning an argument, it's making the truth permanently, publicly, irreversibly true. He paused. He's the most skilled communicator I've ever encountered. He will say things that are genuinely compelling. He'll make some people in that room feel sorry for him. He might even make me feel something. He met Sirius's eyes steadily. But the documentation doesn't change based on feelings. The Concordat stone authentication doesn't change. The compulsion ward on a 15-month-old doesn't change. And the more he talks, the more he explains, the more clearly it becomes visible that the thing he did was the thing he did, regardless of why he says he did it. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. The reading room was quiet around them, the Lake Geneva evening pressing against the windows in shades of gray and silver. You're 9 years old, Sirius said. Sirius, Harry said. I know. Everyone keeps saying it. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. James would have gone in there swinging and Lily would have had to physically restrain him. He paused. Your way is better. I just want you to know I'm aware of that, even if my instincts are, he gestured vaguely at himself. If your instincts cause a problem tomorrow, Nor will manage it, Harry said. Your solicitor is going to manage my instincts. She managed a Wisengamot session, Harry said. She'll manage you. Sirius made a sound that was nearly a laugh. Fair enough. They sat in the reading room as the evening came down outside, and Sirius looked at the Egyptian library materials with growing attention, and asked about them, and Harry told him about the vault and the letters and the journal and the wand cases, and at some point during this conversation something in Sirius's face opened the way things opened in spring, slowly, then irreversibly, and he asked if he could read the letters, James's letters, some of them, and Harry said yes without hesitating. Because they belonged to both of them, in different ways, and there was enough of his father's voice in the pages for both of them to hear it. The ICW board session opened at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning with the formal ceremony of an institution that took its procedural dignity seriously. All 9 board members were present. The public gallery was at capacity. Nor was at the central floor. Harry was with her. Behind him in the gallery were Sirius, Mireille, Apollon, and Ragnarok, who had, with the specific flexibility of the very pragmatic, decided that this particular session constituted a financial matter sufficient to warrant his presence despite the general principle of goblins not attending governance proceedings. Councillor Beaumont presided. He was a compact man in his 60s with a politician's face, pleasant in repose, expressive on command, and he opened the session with the smooth efficiency of someone who has run a great many rooms and had not yet encountered one he couldn't. He acknowledged the formal testimony request. He noted the presence of the petitioner and legal representation. He moved to open deliberation. Before the board opens deliberation, Nor said, from the central floor, in the tone of inevitable momentum, the petitioner's representative needs to table a supplementary filing. She set the folder on the floor's central table. Artifact authentication results, completed yesterday by this institution's own transparency officer under standard ICW protocol. The filing concerns the governance documents that define this board's current authority and review procedures. The room's quality changed. Harry watched it happen, the shift in the 9 board members' postures, the slight increase in attention in the gallery. Beaumont's expression did not change, which was itself a change. "This is not the scheduled agenda," Beaumont said. Under ICW procedural charter, any supplementary filing that bears directly on the board's jurisdiction must be tabled before proceedings begin, Nor said. Article 17, Section 3. A pause. Beaumont was doing calculations. Harry watched him do them behind his pleasant face. "The filing is tabled," said Vargas, from her board seat, before Beaumont could respond. "It is relevant to jurisdiction. Article 17 is clear." Tanaka nodded. Beaumont looked at them both. 7 board members read the authentication results. 2 already knew what they said. 1, Beaumont, did not read the document at all. He looked at the central floor. He looked at Harry. And the door at the back of the room opened. Albus Dumbledore walked in. He came in without hurry, with the same composed deliberateness that Harry had watched him leave the Wisengamot chamber with 3 weeks ago. He wore deep blue robes and his silver beard was immaculate, and his half-moon glasses caught the room's light as he moved through the gallery, creating a path through people who stepped aside for him with the automatic deference of long habit. He stopped at the gallery railing. He looked at Harry on the central floor. Harry looked back. Albus Dumbledore, Marchbanks had called him, at the Wisengamot session. Here, he was just a man in the gallery, no title, no seat, no authority to speak from the floor. He was a witness at most. He was an observer. This was, Harry thought, the first time in possibly decades that he had been in a room where he held no formal position. The board chair looked at him. "Mr. Dumbledore," Beaumont said carefully. "This is a formal proceeding, I would like to speak," Dumbledore said. His voice carried the room without effort. "With the board's permission. As a directly named party in the filing under review." Beaumont opened his mouth. Under ICW Charter, a named party in an active filing may request to address the board, Vargas said, with the flat precision of someone who has read the charter very recently. The request requires a majority vote. I move to allow it. Seconded, Tanaka said. 5-4. Beaumont voted against, but it didn't matter. Dumbledore came to the central floor. He didn't look at Nor. He looked at Harry. "Harry," he said. The name again, the grandfatherly register, the warmth, the specific quality of a man addressing someone he considers both important and beloved. "I owe you a conversation I should have had when you were much younger. You're having it in front of 17 witnesses and an official transcription service," Harry said. "I think that's appropriate." Something moved in Dumbledore's expression, genuine, Harry thought. Not performed. The specific look of a man encountering a response he hadn't expected from a direction he thought he'd fully mapped. He recovered smoothly. "Everything I did," Dumbledore said, to Harry and, with the subtle body language of a skilled communicator, to the room, was done in service of one goal, your survival. Britain's survival. The magical world's survival. Lord Voldemort was not defeated. He was, suspended. And the preparations required to ensure that when he returned, there would be someone capable of facing him, required stealing 61 lordships, Harry said. And jailing my godfather without trial. And putting a compulsion ward on me at 15 months old. Required managing the situation with imperfect tools and genuine urgency, Dumbledore said, and his voice was sorrow rather than defense, which was considerably more dangerous than defense because sorrow was harder to argue with. I made choices I am not entirely at peace with. I would make different choices, knowing what I know now. But the alternative was asking, Harry said. Asking the 61 families. Asking the Wizengamot. Asking the people whose lives you were managing. He held Dumbledore's gaze. You didn't ask because asking would have produced answers you couldn't control. And you needed to control the outcome. I needed to protect, you needed to control, Harry said again, and said it without heat, without anger, with the same flat accuracy with which Amelia Bones had read Pettigrew's confession, because flat accuracy was more honest than anger and more permanent. The protection was real, I believe that you believed in it. But the control was the primary mechanism, and the protection was how you explained the control to yourself. He paused. The Concordat Stone. The 3 ICW governance documents. The 4th document, filed 12 weeks before our British filing, building the international mechanism to nullify whatever we produce domestically. That wasn't protection. That was, he looked at the room, at the board, at Elka in the gallery who was watching with 19 years of patience behind her eyes. That was architecture. Built over years, in multiple jurisdictions, with fraudulent artifacts. That is not someone reacting to an emergency. That is someone who was always planning for the moment when the people they were managing stopped cooperating. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore looked at him. The blue eyes were, Harry had thought he'd see guilt, or calculation, or the managed sorrow. What he saw was something more complicated than any of those, genuine belief in his own account, meeting genuine understanding that his account was insufficient, in real time. The specific experience of a very intelligent person finding out that the story they've been telling themselves has a structural flaw they never identified. The Concordat Stone, Dumbledore said, after a moment. The documents. You understand, the governance reforms at the ICW were necessary. The body was what? Vargas said, from her board seat. Her voice was not loud. Was insufficiently flexible. Was not making the decisions you preferred. Was in need of being made to comply. She looked at him steadily. I voted on those documents, Mr. Dumbledore. In good faith. Under the assumption that they were legitimately ratified. A pause. I don't have words for what I think of you right now that are appropriate for an official record. The stone, Tanaka said. Do you have it with you? A silence. We can request an Auror team from the British DMLE to recover it, Nor said, to the room. Madam Bones has had a standing request prepared since yesterday pending the authentication confirmation. It requires only the board's authorization to execute. Beaumont, who had been very still since Dumbledore arrived, said nothing. 6 board members voted to authorize. 3 abstained. None voted against. Dumbledore reached into his robes. He removed a small stone, palm-sized, dark gray, perfectly smooth. He set it on the central floor's table. The room's magical atmosphere shifted when the stone appeared. Harry felt it, everyone who was magically sensitive felt it, the particular resonance of something very old being in the open after a long time enclosed. Mireille, in the gallery, closed her eyes briefly and then opened them. This is not capitulation, Dumbledore said, to Harry. I want you to understand that. The stone, it was a tool, not a symbol. Returning it changes nothing about what I believed then or what I believe now. Voldemort will return. The magical world will need someone to face him, Harry said. I know. The prophecy, yes, I know about the prophecy. That's in the documents too, Mr. Dumbledore. You consulted a prophecy in 1980 and made every decision that followed based on your interpretation of it. He paused. But the prophecy was about what I might do. You took it as a license for what you would do. Those are different things. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The warmth in his expression was still there. It was always going to be there, Harry thought, because it was genuine, not performed, the warmth of a man who genuinely cared about the world in the large impersonal way that sometimes made individual people invisible. You will be extraordinary, Dumbledore said softly, and meant it as something offered rather than observed. I already am, Harry said. Simply. Without arrogance, just as a statement of what the blood test had confirmed and the last 3 weeks had demonstrated. And it happened anyway. Without your management. Without the control. Without, he stopped. Looked at the stone on the table, at the room, at Sirius in the gallery whose expression was the careful stillness of someone holding himself very precisely in place. He looked back at Dumbledore. You could have asked me, he said, and it came out differently from the rest, quieter, not for the room but for the man. Not the arrangement, not the strategy. Me. You could have asked me what I wanted. I was a person before I was a symbol. The silence was different now. The room understood it was finished. Dumbledore looked at him. He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at the stone on the table. He looked at the gallery, at Sirius, briefly, and something in his face did something specific and private when he looked at Sirius that Harry couldn't fully read but that Sirius met with the flat steadiness of someone who has finished grieving a thing. Then Dumbledore picked up his robes, turned, and walked toward the back of the room. Not running. Not fleeing. Simply leaving, in the same unhurried way he did everything, except that the room he was leaving was one he had spent decades maneuvering to be indispensable to, and he was walking out of it as an ordinary man. He paused at the door. He didn't look back. He said, clearly enough to Carrie, I hope you're ready, Harry. When the time comes. I will be, Harry said. And I'll have chosen to be. That's the difference. The door closed. The vote on the governance documents took 40 minutes. All 3 were nullified, the board's fraudulently ratified authority, the non-appeal precedent, the expanded discretionary power, all of it, null from inception, never legally existing. The 4th document, the preemptive mechanism against the British filing, collapsed with them. The financial reclamation filing was referred to a newly constituted 3-member neutral panel, Vargas, Tanaka, and a Brazilian coordinator named Supervisor Andrade who had arrived that morning after Elka had sent her a briefing and who had walked in 40 minutes into the session with the expression of someone who had read everything on the journey and had opinions. The panel's preliminary indication, issued verbally before the session closed, was that the reclamation would be upheld in full. Beaumont resigned his board position during the afternoon recess. He did not explain why. Nobody required him to. The Concordat stone was transferred to ICW Heritage Custody by end of day, where it was catalogued under its correct name, its history accurately documented, and its legal status as an artifact last known used by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore attached permanently to its record. Harry left the ICW building at 6 in the evening, when the session had concluded and the paperwork had been filed and Nor had shaken his hand with the expression of someone who has just finished the most significant case of their career and is attempting to be professional about it. He walked out of the building's main entrance with Sirius, into the November evening, onto the Geneva lakefront where the grey water moved in long quiet rolls under a sky that was beginning to clear. Sirius stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. Grim old place, Sirius said. It's going to need a lot of work. I know, Harry said. Creature has started on the portrait gallery. Several of them are unhappy. He paused. My mother's portrait specifically has what I can only describe as a comprehensive agenda. I heard, Harry said. We're going to need to deal with that. We will. Sirius looked at him sideways. Are you actually going to come and live there? You don't have to. The Black Estate has resources, I could arrange something else, somewhere more serious, Harry said. Right. Yes. You said all right. He ran a hand through his hair, which needed cutting and probably always would. I just want to. I know it's not going to be easy. I'm still, he stopped. I'm working on it. I know, Harry said. You're not worried about that? No, Harry said. And he wasn't, not in the performative way of someone pretending things were simpler than they were, but in the real way of someone who had looked at the situation honestly and decided that it was manageable and that manageable was enough to begin with. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the lake, and the water moved in its grey rolls, and the sky above Geneva continued very slowly to clear. He wasn't entirely wrong about Voldemort, Sirius said, quietly. No, Harry said. He wasn't. That part's real. But it was never his to manage alone. He paused. Nothing was. And when Voldemort does come back? Harry looked at the water. He thought about 94 on a scale of 100, provisional, lower than the real number. He thought about the cloak in his interior pocket. He thought about the library in Egypt and the wands in their cases and 61 lordships and a compulsion ward that had failed to make him fully compliant because of fey blood he hadn't known he had. He thought about a Veela elder who had smelled something wrong in a street and walked into a bank. Then I'll deal with it, he said. The way I deal with things. Which is? Get the documentation in order, Harry said. Find the right people. Understand the full shape of the problem before I move. He paused. And not be afraid of anyone. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was a full laugh this time, not the rough abbreviated thing from the ministry facility, but something more complete, something that had recovered more of itself than it had 3 weeks ago. James, he said, shaking his head. You keep saying that, Harry said. You keep proving it, Sirius said. Behind them, the ICW building put out its public lights one by one. Ahead of them, somewhere across the water, the Alps were doing their usual thing of being enormous and indifferent. Geneva did its precise, grey, international business around them, entirely unaware that 2 people on its lakefront were standing in the specific quiet of something being resolved. Harry looked at the water for another moment. Then he turned toward the street, toward where Ragnak and Mireille and Nor and Apollon were waiting outside a restaurant that Apollon had chosen on the grounds that they had all been working for 18 hours and required feeding before anything else. Come on, Harry said. Sirius fell into step beside him. The 61 lordships, he said. Are you actually going to manage all of them? I have people, Harry said. Ragnak. Ragnak, Nor, forthright, Elka once she's formally connected with our team, which she will be. He paused. And you? Sirius looked at him. Me. The Black Lordship is restored. You're Lord Black. You have a Wisengamot seat. Harry glanced at him sideways. I could use someone in that chamber who is genuinely not afraid of anything. Sirius held his gaze. Something shifted in his expression, something that was not healed, because 12 years in Azkaban was not 3 weeks undone, but something that was oriented, pointed toward a direction, anchored to something real. All right, he said. They reached the restaurant. Through the window Harry could see Ragnak's profile, characteristically still, characteristically attentive, and Mireille's hat, and the silver of Apollon's hair, and Nor's ink-stained right hand on the table. He pulled the door open. Warm air and the sound of conversation spilled out onto the November evening. Behind them, Geneva's lake kept moving. The sky had cleared enough, finally, to show the first few stars coming through over the Alps, faint but there, steady as the kind of things that were always true whether you could currently see them or not. Harry walked in. In the months that followed, the financial reclamation was upheld in full by the ICW neutral panel. The 61 lordship restorations were formalized in a Wisengamot vote that passed 178 to 3, the 3 dissenting votes were later subject to their own investigation. Albus Dumbledore was located in Scotland 6 weeks after the Geneva session, having returned quietly, and was formally charged under both British magical law and ICW governance statutes. He cooperated with the investigation and was not imprisoned, which was either justice or mercy depending on who you asked, though the legal sanctions placed on his authority were permanent and comprehensive. He retired to a small house in Godric's Hollow and was seen, occasionally, in the village, and was reported by those who encountered him to be quiet and occasionally kind and genuinely aged in a way he had not been before. Sirius Black took his Wizengamot seat in January and was, by all accounts, exactly as much trouble in the chamber as anyone who had known him in school would have predicted, which was, depending again on who you asked, either a problem or precisely what the chamber needed. The Black estate underwent significant renovation, primarily because Harry observed that a house should feel like a house rather than a museum to grievances, and Sirius had agreed with this assessment and then spent 3 weeks arguing with Kreacher about the curtains, which Harry had found genuinely entertaining. Mireille Fontaine returned to France and sent letters that were brief and practical and occasionally contained things that were neither, and Harry always wrote back. Ragnarok continued to be Ragnarok, which was the highest possible compliment. Egypt remained, waiting, with more in it than one trip had uncovered. Harry Potter went to Hogwarts the following September, at age 11, which was when he was supposed to go. He arrived already knowing what he was, and what had been taken from him, and what he was capable of. He arrived as Lord of 61 Houses, with a solicitor on retainer, a godfather in the Wizengamot, and a cloak in his trunk that technically didn't exist. The sorting hat took 45 seconds. This was, apparently, longer than average. Nobody who had been paying attention was surprised.